Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Mysterious Lake in Montana. I never believed in superstitions. At least, that's what I used to tell myself. The old-timers in town would speak in hushed tones about the lake. They'd tell stories, half joking, about how boats disappear without a trace, swallowed by the dark water. As a seasoned fisherman, I had always dismissed these tales. But when I arrived at that lake for the first time, I couldn't shake off a strange feeling. It was early in the morning, just as the sun began to stretch its first golden fingers across the horizon. The water was calm, the surface a perfect mirror reflecting the jagged mountains surrounding the lake. The small boat I had rented glided effortlessly across the glassy water, its motor purring softly. The air was crisp, the kind of coolness that makes the world feel awake but not yet fully alive. I had come here alone, seeking some peace, some solitude away from the constant buzz of life. The lake, with its eerie reputation, seemed like the perfect place. My friends had warned me against it, of course. You'll hear things, they'd said. Strange sounds. People disappearing. You better be careful out there. I had laughed it off, of course. This was just another place to fish. But as the boat drifted farther from shore, I started to notice the stillness. The kind of silence that presses in on you, the silence that's almost too quiet. I shook it off and focused on the task at hand, casting my line into the water. The rod was heavy in my hands, and as I cast it out, I felt a strange tug, a pull that seemed deeper than usual, like something under the water was watching me. It wasn't the fish I was used to. It was something else. Something cold, unfamiliar. A ripple spread across the surface, but not from my line. The water shifted unnaturally, as if something large had just stirred beneath it. I gripped the boat's edge tighter, a knot forming in my stomach. It wasn't just the movement in the water. It was the feeling that I wasn't alone. I looked around, scanning the empty shorelines. No one. Nothing. Just the soft mist rising from the water, the only company the occasional bird's call. Still, something tugged at me, something dark beneath the surface. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the wind, or some stray animal disturbing the lake. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. That something out there was waiting for me to make a mistake. A distant sound broke the silence, a faint, almost imperceptible sound. At first, I thought it was the wind. But no, it wasn't. It was too deliberate. A splash, too distant to be anything close, but it was there. It was followed by a second, then a third, each one closer than the last. I stared into the water, but there was nothing. Just ripples. My heart began to race. I stood up, clutching the boat's edge, trying to steady myself. Was I just being paranoid? Was it the isolation? The fog that had started to roll in, thick and suffocating? Or was there really something out there? And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shape. A shadow beneath the water. It wasn't just a ripple, it was something moving, something that shouldn't have been there. The shadow stretched, curling in a way that made no sense. My pulse quickened as the figure grew more distinct. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it. Just a trick of the light, I whispered to myself, but even I didn't believe the words. The shadow moved again, this time unmistakable. It wasn't a fish. It was too large, too deliberate. Panic gripped me, but I tried to remain calm. My rational mind told me that it was probably just some freak of nature, a shadow from an underwater rock or a school of fish passing by. But my instinct screamed otherwise. The figure lingered, motionless but for its subtle shift in the depths. The sounds continued. Soft, like the lapping of water against the boat, but rhythmic now, more like something walking. My breath caught in my throat. The shadows under the water were moving closer, and I was suddenly aware of how utterly alone I was. The silence around me felt like it was pressing in, and the weight of the lake's eerie presence became suffocating. Something was wrong. I couldn't explain it. It didn't make sense. But I could feel it. The lake was alive, and it was watching me. The first instinct was to leave. To speed back to shore, forget all about this cursed place and its stories. But the boat didn't move. The motor sputtered, refusing to start. The sharp hum of the engine, once a comforting sound, now felt like an alien noise in the stillness of the morning. I tried again and again, each attempt meeting with failure. The boat refused to obey. Then I saw it. In the distance, not far from me now, another shape. It surfaced briefly, just enough for me to make it out. A figure, tall and thin, silhouetted against the dark water. It was there, just beneath the surface. I stared, frozen in place, unable to look away. It was coming closer. A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't a trick of the light. This wasn't something explainable. There was something in the water, something that shouldn't be. Something that was drawing closer with every passing second. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished. But the feeling remained. The boat drifted with a gentle current, yet my hands gripped the edges with a vice-like pressure. My pulse was erratic, the steady beat now overtaken by a frantic rhythm that matched the growing sense of dread in my chest. I scanned the water around me, desperately searching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, only the ripples I had made, slowly fading away into the stillness. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. It's nothing, I told myself. Just a figment of your imagination. You're tired, and the fog is playing tricks on you. But the thought didn't comfort me. It only deepened the panic gnawing at my insides. I stared into the water, feeling that same weight on my chest, as if the very depths beneath were pulling me down, urging me to surrender. I didn't dare move. The silence now felt wrong. It was too quiet, too thick, pressing against my ears until they ached. Then, the sounds returned. Soft at first, a faint, almost imperceptible splash, followed by another, closer this time. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't some animal stirring beneath the surface. No, this was something purposeful. Someone or something was out there, moving beneath the water, moving toward me. I jerked my head to the left, searching frantically. There, just beneath the water's surface, I saw another shadow, a flicker that shouldn't have been there. It was fleeting, but unmistakable. This time, I didn't wait. I tried to start the engine again, my hands trembling as I yanked the pull cord. The motor sputtered for a moment, then died. No. No, no, no. I tried again, more forcefully this time, but the same result. The boat sat motionless, helpless in the vast emptiness of the lake. My heart raced, and I could feel the sweat beating on my forehead, stinging my eyes. "Come on," I muttered, the words escaping in a frantic whisper. I turned the key, pulled at the cord again and again. But nothing. The engine refused to start. A low, hollow sound broke through the quiet, a sound that didn't belong to the wind or the water or any animal I knew. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It sounded like footsteps. But underwater, the sound reverberated from below, faint but persistent. The shadow beneath the water moved again, this time more clearly visible. I couldn't breathe. I didn't know what to do, my thoughts a tangled mess. There was no explanation, no reason for what was happening. Just a sinking realization that I was trapped on a boat, in the middle of a lake, with something in the depths below that was aware of me. I could feel it, the way the water seemed to press in closer, as if something beneath was pushing against the boat. Then, without warning, a wave, unnatural and sudden, rocked the boat, throwing me off balance. I gripped the sides, trying to steady myself, but the water around me surged again, this time far more violently, as though something beneath had just made a move, something massive, something alive. I could hear it now, the sound of splashing water, frantic and urgent as the figure emerged from the depths. The shadow, now unmistakable, rose from the water with unnatural speed. It was large, far larger than any fish I had ever seen. The silhouette was humanoid in shape, but its outline was distorted, shifting in the murky depths as if it were made of the water itself. It was tall, impossibly tall, and thin, far too thin, its form unnervingly elongated. The water began to churn around the boat, the ripples growing more intense. I could see the dark outline of its form as it moved, its motion deliberate, slow, but unmistakably purposeful. It was coming closer. And then, its eyes. I don't know how I knew they were eyes. The shape was submerged, barely visible, but I saw them, two faint, glowing orbs, just beneath the surface of the water. They were watching me, staring at me with an intensity that seemed to pierce right through to my soul. I tried to move, tried to get the boat to start again, but the engine remained silent. The shadow moved closer still, and I could hear it now, the footsteps, like a rhythmic tapping from beneath the boat. The silence of the lake was gone, replaced by the haunting, hollow sounds of something alive under the water, moving ever closer. It was then I realized. The lake wasn't just a body of water. It was something alive. A living, breathing entity. Something ancient. And it was watching me. The shadows beneath the water weren't mere reflections. They were something else, something far older, far darker, and far more dangerous. The water churned once more, and the boat lurched violently to the side. My heart raced. The boat was tilting now. My legs were unsteady beneath me as I grabbed hold of the sides, trying desperately to keep myself from falling into the cold, dark water. Then the water surged upwards, a sudden and violent force that seemed to be coming from all directions. I saw the figure again, closer now, almost within reach. The water parted in front of it, and I could make out its long, sinewy limbs. It was moving toward me, its eyes glowing in the murk. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I froze, my mind racing, my heart hammering. What was this thing? What did it want? Why was it coming for me? In a desperate panic, I scrambled to grab my paddle, trying to push myself away, trying to get some distance between me and that thing. The boat rocked again, more violently this time, and I felt the cold water begin to spill over the sides. The figure moved again, closer, so close now. And then, in the blink of an eye, I was plunged into darkness. The boat tilted completely, and the water rushed in. I was falling into the depths. Cold. I was drowning. The freezing water engulfed me, swallowing me whole, pulling me down into the abyss. My lungs burned as I gasped for air, but there was nothing but water, deep and endless. Panic surged through me as I flailed, reaching for the surface that felt miles away. The lake's chill seeped into my bones, but it wasn't just the cold that paralyzed me, it was the overwhelming sense that something else was down here with me. Something watching. Something waiting. I kicked, pushing against the pressure, trying to reach the surface. My vision was clouded, the world above me a blurry patch of dim light filtering through the water. My mind raced, but all I could think of was the shadow beneath me, the thing that had come for me, the thing that was still there. I broke the surface with a sharp gasp, coughing and choking on the air, desperate for any breath I could get. My hands scraped against the boat, but it was drifting away from me, its edge just out of reach. The water around me was black, churning with an unnatural force, as if the lake itself was alive, pulling me deeper. I was still panicking, still fighting against the pull of the water. My heart hammered in my chest, and every instinct screamed at me to swim, to escape. But then I heard it again, the sound beneath the water, the rhythmic footsteps, like a slow, deliberate march, getting closer. I whipped my head around, terrified of what I might see, and there it was. The shadow. It was submerged just beneath the water's surface, its form now unmistakable. A figure, no, not just a figure, but a mass of darkness, an almost fluid shape moving with unnatural grace. The eyes. I could see them again, glowing faintly from beneath the water, staring at me with an intensity that felt like they were cutting into my very soul. It was coming closer. I tried to swim, my arms flailing in a desperate attempt to push myself away. But the water felt thick, like 100 hands were grabbing at me, pulling me back. My legs were heavy, my body numb. I couldn't escape. It was too strong. Then, I felt it, a cold hand, or something like it, brush against my ankle. The touch was light, almost tender, but it chilled me to the core. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. That was it. The moment I had been dreading. I had always known it was coming. Something from the depths of the lake was here, and it wasn't letting me go. The figure moved again, the shadows swirling, shifting in the water as it closed in on me. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was alive, a twisting, formless mass of blackness, a nightmare taking shape. The water around me churned, swirling in unnatural patterns as if it had a mind of its own. And those eyes, those glowing eyes, were locked on me, unblinking. I couldn't move. The terror paralyzed me. Then the pressure intensified. It felt like the lake itself was pulling me down, deeper into its cold, suffocating embrace. The shadow was closer now, moving with an eerie slowness, but with a purpose. Its eyes never left me, never blinked, and the footsteps continued, rhythmic and deliberate, reverberating through the water as if it was marching toward me. A voice, distant and strange, echoed in my mind, faint but undeniable. It's coming for you. You can't escape. I tried to scream, but the water was in my mouth, choking me. Panic surged, my chest tightening with terror as the weight of the water dragged me down further. I was sinking, the pressure increasing with every passing second. The light from above was fading, and the darkness of the lake surrounded me, smothering me. The shadow was right there now. It was all around me, its presence thick and oppressive. I could feel it, like a cold fog wrapping around me. Its eyes were close, so close I could almost reach out and touch them. They burned with an unnatural light, a terrible understanding of the fear that filled me. And then it spoke. Not with words, but with a feeling. A cold, ancient whisper that slithered into my mind. You should have left. You should have never come. The shadow moved again, and this time I felt its touch. It was not a hand, not a physical touch. It was a sensation, a pressure, like the weight of the water itself was closing in around me. I gasped, my lungs fighting for air, but it was no use. The water was rising, filling my chest, my throat. The darkness was swallowing me whole. I had never been this afraid in my life. I had never felt this small, this insignificant. Whatever this thing was, whatever it had been, or had become, it was beyond me. Beyond anything I could comprehend. It was the lake. It had always been the lake. And now, it was taking me. I closed my eyes, the cold pressure of the water pushing me down, deeper still. But as I sank into the darkness, I realized something. I wasn't alone. Not anymore. The shadow was with me, beneath the water, in the depths of the lake. It was always there. And now, so was I. I couldn't breathe. My lungs burned with each agonizing second, each breath a desperate, futile attempt to draw in air. The pressure around me intensified, not just from the weight of the water, but from the very presence of the shadow itself. It surrounded me, pulling me deeper, its cold tendrils slipping through my thoughts, my body, as if it had no need for physical form anymore. There was no escaping it. In the endless blackness of the lake, time lost its meaning. I wasn't sure if I had been sinking for moments or hours. My mind, clouded by terror, flickered between fragments of thought. Was I hallucinating? Was I already dead? Could this really be happening? I tried to move. My limbs felt like lead, heavy and unresponsive. I wanted to swim, to escape, but the water was thicker than it had been before, more like a viscous gel that clung to me, pulling me back as if the lake itself was a living, breathing entity intent on holding me prisoner. The shadow was still with me, hovering just beyond my reach, its eyes, those glowing, unblinking eyes, shining like distant stars in the inky depths. I couldn't look away from them, even as my fear rose. They weren't just eyes, they were windows into something beyond, something ancient and unfathomable. It knows me, I thought. It has always known me. The whisper echoed again, not with words, but with a strange presence that filled my mind. It was more than a voice, it was a feeling, an understanding. You are mine now. You belong to the depths. The weight of those words settled like a stone in my chest. There was no struggle. There was no escape. I was drowning, but it wasn't the water that was taking me. It was something far worse, something more terrifying than the physical cold and weight pressing against me. I looked around desperately, trying to find any shred of hope, any sign of escape, but the darkness was absolute. It pressed in from every side, a crushing, suffocating blackness. The water around me was no longer just water. It felt alive, like it was pulsing, breathing with a will of its own. The shadows shifted around me, moving with an eerie grace, undisturbed by the laws of nature. It's here. It's with me. I could feel the presence more strongly now. The shadow was no longer just a distant figure beneath the surface. It was all around me, its form blending with the water, becoming one with it. I couldn't distinguish where the water ended and the shadow began. It was everywhere. Its cold touch was constant, a reminder that there was no escape. It was pulling me, drawing me further into its grasp. A sudden force jerked me downward, the water swallowing me whole. Panic surged through my chest as I kicked and fought, but it was no use. The shadow was too strong. The pressure around me was unbearable, my body becoming numb as I was dragged deeper, further into the abyss. Then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. The water went still. The pressure released, but it wasn't a relief. It was more suffocating than ever. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My body was frozen in place, unable to respond to my frantic commands. I felt the eyes again, close now, inches from my face. Their gaze was unyielding, cold, and filled with an ancient sorrow that spoke to me without words. I wasn't just trapped. I wasn't just drowning. I was chosen. This was where I was meant to be. The shadow moved closer, its form now unmistakable. It wasn't just an entity or a spirit. It was the lake itself. A living, breathing force of nature, ancient beyond comprehension. The lake was its home, and I was its prisoner. I wanted to scream, to fight, but the water filled my mouth, my throat, choking me. I couldn't escape. I couldn't do anything. And as the cold darkness closed around me, I realized something else. The lake didn't just want to take me. It wanted to consume me. I felt the weight of it, the pull of the depths, as it dragged me further into the darkness. The water was no longer just cold, it was suffocating, a thick liquid that clung to me like a second skin. Every inch of me, from my lungs to my mind, was filled with the cold, the silence, the overwhelming presence of the lake. It wasn't just the water. It wasn't just the shadow. It was the lake itself, its endless depths, its infinite reach, its ancient hunger. It was a living thing, and I was a part of it now. And just as I thought I would lose consciousness, just as I thought I would be consumed by the abyss, I heard it. A sound, faint at first, like the distant hum of something alive. The shadow shifted, the water moving around me in strange, unnatural ways. I felt a ripple, a subtle shift in the pressure. Something else was coming. Something worse. And that's when I knew the lake didn't just take people. It made them part of itself. Every lost soul, every vanished boat, every shadow beneath the surface. They were all part of the lake's endless hunger. And now, I was one of them. The water closed over my head again, and I was no longer sure where I ended and the lake began. The depths had claimed me. The darkness was absolute. I thought I had reached the end, that my struggle was over. But I was wrong. There was no end here, no release, only the weight of the water and the suffocating presence of the lake that consumed me whole. The cold wrapped around me like a shroud, but somehow I still felt the weight of its ancient gaze, those eyes, distant yet always present, never leaving me. I couldn't see. I couldn't move. But somehow, I could feel everything. The depths pressed in from every direction, and in the silence, I heard the slow, rhythmic pulse of the water, like the beating heart of something much older than me. The shadow was still there, somewhere in the depths, lurking just out of reach. It was always watching, always waiting. I tried to scream, to shout, to fight against the suffocating pull of the lake, but there was no sound. No air. My body felt as though it was being pulled apart, dissolved in the vast, cold emptiness. I could feel the remnants of myself, my thoughts, my memories, fading, becoming nothing more than the very thing that held me in its grip. The water was alive. It wasn't just a body of liquid that I had fallen into. It had a presence, a consciousness, a will of its own. It had claimed me, yes, but it had also made me part of something much larger. The lake's hunger was insatiable. It took everything, consumed it, and left nothing behind. The shadow moved again, shifting in the water like a wave, but it didn't approach. It watched, always watching, as if waiting for something I couldn't understand. Its eyes gleamed faintly in the dark, brighter now, as if it had recognized me, recognized that I had become part of the lake. I wasn't sure what it wanted, what it was, but I could feel it in every inch of my being. Its ancient power seeped into me, touching the core of my soul. I wanted to understand, to comprehend what was happening, but the more I tried, the more the water seemed to close in on me, drowning me in confusion, in the emptiness of it all. The sense of time was gone. It was as if I had ceased to exist, and yet I was still there. Still trapped. Still aware. I began to feel the presence of others. Not just the shadow, but other things, other beings, beneath the surface. Their minds, their souls, lost to the lake. I could feel their despair, their confusion, their terror. They were all there with me, fading echoes of lost souls. I could hear their whispers, their cries, their regrets, all swirling around me in the endless, inescapable dark. Had they too been taken? I thought. Had they fought like I did? A wave of memory crashed over me, flashes of my life, of who I once was. I remembered the world above, the sun, the warmth, the feel of the earth beneath my feet. But it was fading now, slipping through my fingers like water. The lake had erased it. Everything I had known was gone. I was no longer who I was. I was part of the lake, part of its hunger, part of the shadow that watched. I could feel the weight of the water as it pressed in tighter around me, and I understood now. The lake was not just a place of death. It was a prison. It was an endless cycle, a never-ending stretch of darkness where those who were lost never truly left. They were taken, absorbed, and made part of the lake's insatiable thirst. There was no escape. There was no end. Only the lake. Only the shadow. And in the distance, through the oppressive darkness, I thought I saw something else, a figure, another lost soul, a reflection of myself. The water rippled around it, distorting its shape, but I could feel its presence, just as real as my own. It was moving toward me, a silent watcher in the depths, as if it knew I was now one of them, that I had become part of the endless, swirling tide. I couldn't move, but I could feel it. The lake was watching. The shadow was always there, always waiting. And the others, those who had come before me, those who would come after me, they were all part of this eternal, suffocating force. And so, as the water closed around me once more, I knew the truth. I wasn't lost in the lake. I was becoming it. The shadow had always been here. It had always been waiting for me, just as it had waited for all the others. And now, I was part of its endless, watery gaze. The depths had claimed me, just as they had claimed everyone before me. The lake had no end. Only endless depths. Endless shadows. And endless watchers. And I would never escape. Oregon dark forest. Have you ever wandered into a forest where the trees seem to whisper? Not just the rustling of leaves in the wind, but something more deliberate? As if they were speaking to you, beckoning you deeper into the shadows? I didn't believe it at first either. But I've learned differently as I found myself lost in the heart of Oregon's wilderness. I've been hiking alone for hours, following a narrow trail that seemed to stretch endlessly through the dense forest. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the occasional chirp of birds or the distant rustle of branches. But as the hours passed, the quiet began to feel oppressive, heavy, like something was watching me. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I should have turned back. But something in me, perhaps the thrill of being out there alone, pushed me to continue, to see what lay beyond the next rise. I wasn't entirely sure where I was anymore. The trail had become faint, barely a trace against the thick undergrowth. Yet, I pressed on, ignoring the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. Then I saw it. A shadow. A figure, maybe 10 feet to my right. It was tall, thin, and seemed to flicker in and out of existence like a mirage. My heart skipped a beat, but when I whipped my head around to look, there was nothing there. Just a forest. Nothing unusual. My breath came in shallow gasps as I stood frozen, staring into the empty space where the figure had been. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me, I told myself. The isolation, the silence, it could all do that to a person. I wasn't used to being out here alone for so long, and I wasn't used to this kind of eerie stillness. But then, I heard it. A soft footfall, the faintest crunch of leaves beneath a boot. It was so quiet that I questioned whether I had imagined it. I turned, looking back over my shoulder. Again, nothing. No movement, no sign of anything. The forest was as still as it had been moments ago. Maybe it was just an animal, I reasoned. A deer or something. But still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My instincts were on edge, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I quickened my pace, my boots crunching louder now, desperate to get out of the woods and back to the trail. But every time I glanced over my shoulder, the shadows seemed to grow longer, darker, more tangible. And I couldn't help but feel that something was following me. I tried to push the feeling away. It was just a trick of the mind, right? The forest had a way of playing with your senses, making you feel things that weren't there. But no matter how fast I walked, no matter how many turns I made, I couldn't shake the sensation. The sound of footsteps behind me was faint but constant, never louder, never fading. Always there. As the forest grew darker, I began to doubt my judgment. I had been hiking for too long, and the sun was nearly gone. The path I thought I had been following seemed to be leading me in circles. My map, which had been so reliable earlier, now felt useless in this tangled mess of trees. I should have made camp for the night, but panic was beginning to set in. I couldn't admit to myself that I might be lost. I started calling out, my voice cracking in the stillness. "Hello? Is anyone there?" But the only response was the deepening silence of the forest. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again. A shadow, just a flicker, but this time it was closer. And this time, I didn't dare look directly at it. I turned my head slowly, pretending to be calm, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But when I turned back, I saw the shadow again. This time, it wasn't just an outline. It was more defined, more solid, standing just beyond the trees. I froze. My heart thudded in my chest, and I was sure I could hear it thud, 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 matching my own heartbeat. The figure was tall, its shape unnaturally thin. I could make out no distinct features, no face, but the presence of something, was palpable. And it was watching me. I didn't know what to do. Should I run? Should I call for help? I felt paralyzed, unable to move. But I knew I had to leave, to escape whatever was out there, stalking me. I turned and started walking faster, then broke into a run, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I stumbled through the underbrush, tripping over roots and rocks, but I didn't care. All I could think about was getting out of there, back to civilization, away from whatever was following me. I tried not to look back, but the compulsion to glance over my shoulder was overwhelming. Each time I did, the shadow was closer, always closer. And each time I saw it, I felt my heart sink further. It wasn't just following me. It was waiting for something. Watching me. Waiting for me to make a mistake. I kept running, the forest blurring around me, but the footsteps, the whispers, were still there, just behind me. Always. And no matter how fast I ran, no matter how much I wished for the path to open up, the shadows were right there, growing darker, more defined, just beyond my reach. I couldn't escape. I ran until my legs burned, until my chest felt like it was about to explode, but still, the shadows followed. Each time I glanced back, there they were, darker, closer, moving with an unnatural, deliberate pace. The trees seemed to close in around me, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands, forcing me deeper into the labyrinth of the forest. I wasn't sure how much time had passed, minutes, hours, it all blurred together in a haze of panic. My heart raced, and with each ragged breath, I could feel my resolve slipping. The deeper I went, the harder it became to tell where I was. I passed the same rock formation 3 times. The same fallen log. I was moving in circles, and the realization that I was lost sent a wave of terror crashing over me. I stopped, panting, my hands resting on my knees as I bent over to catch my breath. The sounds of the forest were oddly muffled, as though the very air had thickened with something dark. I couldn't hear the birds anymore, or the wind rustling through the leaves. All I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat and the faint, shuffling sound that seemed to be coming closer. No. I can't stop. Not now. But my legs refused to move. They felt heavy, like lead, and my mind was too consumed with dread to focus on anything else. I glanced over my shoulder, and my stomach turned. The shadow was there again, just beyond the trees, but now it was different. It was no longer flickering in and out of view like before. It had taken shape, tall, thin, and with arms that seemed to stretch unnaturally long, reaching toward me in the dim light. I could see its eyes now, 2 small points of glowing red that pierced through the darkness. They didn't blink, didn't waver. They just stared, unblinking, watching me. The air around me grew colder, and a shiver ran down my spine. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet felt like they were glued to the ground. The figure didn't move. It just watched. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead, and I could feel my pulse thumping in my ears. My legs screamed in protest as I forced myself to turn and stumble forward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But it didn't matter. I couldn't outrun it. It was everywhere now, the darkness, the eyes, the shadows that followed my every move. The ground beneath me shifted. The path, if it could even be called that, was disappearing, replaced by thick underbrush and uneven terrain. I was running blind now, not caring where I went as long as I could escape the eyes that followed me. But every time I tried to turn, every time I thought I saw a break in the trees, the shadows moved, blocking my way. It was like they were guiding me, forcing me deeper into the heart of the forest. And then I heard it, a whisper, soft at first, but growing louder. A voice that came from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You can't escape." I froze, my blood running cold. The voice wasn't human. It was raspy, echoing through the trees like it had been here far longer than I had. The words didn't make sense. How could something so ancient speak to me? I looked around frantically, trying to locate the source of the voice, but there was nothing. The figure with the red eyes had disappeared. The forest was still. Too still. The whisper came again, this time closer, like it was right behind me. "You can't run." I whipped around, but there was no one there. Only the trees, standing silent and watchful in the gloom. The shadows were growing darker, shifting, as if they were alive. Something had changed. The forest wasn't just a place anymore, it was alive, and it was toying with me. I had to find a way out. I had to escape before I became part of it, part of the shadows that crept just beyond the edges of my vision. But as I turned to find a way, something caught my eye, a flicker of movement, a figure darting between the trees, just out of sight. My pulse quickened. It was the shadow again, or something like it. It wasn't far. I could feel its presence. I had no choice but to follow it. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I couldn't. The forest was closing in, the path narrowing until there was only one direction left to go. The figure had to be leading me somewhere. Maybe if I followed it, I could find a way out. Maybe it was just a trick of the mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that if I didn't follow, I would be lost forever. The further I went, the colder it became, the trees growing denser and the shadows deeper. The whispers returned, louder this time, swirling around me like an oppressive storm. I couldn't tell if they were voices from the forest or voices in my head. But one thing was clear, the forest was changing. It wasn't the same place I had entered. The path was gone, replaced by a maze of tangled roots and dark thickets. And then I saw it. A clearing ahead. The figure was there, standing at the edge, motionless, waiting for me. But something was wrong. There was no light in the clearing, no moon, no stars. Just darkness. Deep, suffocating darkness that seemed to swallow everything whole. I had to stop. But it was too late. Something had already found me. I stopped at the edge of the clearing, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The figure in the center didn't move, but the sense of dread that clung to the air was thick, almost suffocating. The darkness within the clearing felt alive, as if it were watching me, waiting for something. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. Every instinct told me to turn back, to flee, but my body wouldn't move. The shadows around me seemed to draw closer, the trees pressing in, their gnarled limbs like twisted fingers, reaching toward me. The air was too cold, too still. My thoughts were muddled, and for a moment, I wondered if I was losing my mind. The whisper came again, but this time it wasn't in my head, it was real, a voice rising from the depths of the darkness. "You're too late." I couldn't tell where the voice came from. It echoed all around me, as though the trees themselves were speaking. My pulse hammered in my chest, and my legs trembled beneath me. I wanted to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. It was still just standing there, waiting, its red eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. What does it want? I took a cautious step forward, my feet heavy on the soft earth beneath me. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its gaze, as if it was aware of every move I made. I could hear the faint rustling of leaves in the wind, but it was wrong, too rhythmic, too deliberate. The shadows around me seemed to pulse, like the forest itself was alive, breathing with me. The voice whispered again, "You don't belong here." The words were cold, cutting through me like a blade. I took another step, this time more hesitant, but my eyes never left the figure. There was something about it that didn't make sense. It wasn't just its shape, its glowing eyes, it was everything. It was wrong. It wasn't human. It's watching me like I'm its prey. I should have turned back. I should have fought the rising panic and ignored the urge to run. But something drew me in. Something about the figure's stillness, the way it beckoned me silently, made me feel like I was meant to be there, like I was part of this place. The shadows deepened as I stepped into the clearing. The temperature dropped even further, and the trees around me seemed to lean in, closing off the world behind me. The ground beneath my feet felt soft, but also uneven, as if it were sinking, pulling me into the earth. I didn't dare look away from the figure. As I approached, the air grew heavier, thicker. Every movement felt sluggish, as if the darkness itself were slowing me down, pulling me into its grip. And then, I felt it, the first brush of something cold against my skin, like a breath, but not from a human. It was the sensation of something ancient, something powerful. Something that had been waiting for a long time. I wanted to scream, to run, but my voice caught in my throat. There was no sound now except for the faint rustling of the leaves and the slow, deliberate steps of something behind me. I froze. It's here. The footsteps weren't mine. They were too close, too deliberate. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Slowly, I turned my head, forcing my eyes to look behind me. And that's when I saw it. A figure emerging from the shadows. It was no longer just a flicker, no longer a fleeting presence. This time, it was solid, and it was much closer. The same tall, thin shape, with long, elongated limbs and eyes that gleamed like red-hot embers. Its face was a black void, empty, with no features, just darkness, staring at me with an unblinking, eternal gaze. I stumbled back, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I tried to scream, but the words didn't come. My legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in the clearing with the figure closing in on me. The shadow didn't speak. It didn't need to. The air around me was suffocating, and every inch closer it came, the weight on my chest grew heavier. I'm going to die here. The thought hit me like a brick, but I couldn't shake it. This was it. The forest had claimed me. And just as I thought it was over, as the darkness closed in, a new figure emerged from the other side of the clearing. This one wasn't like the first. It wasn't tall or thin. It was familiar. Human, perhaps, but wrong in every possible way. The eyes were too wide, the skin too pale. It had no expression, no emotion, just a blank, hollow stare. Another one? I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I was surrounded. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what was happening, but I couldn't find an answer. The figure stepped closer, its hollow gaze locking onto mine, as if it was waiting for something. Waiting for me to make a move. And then, from the forest beyond the clearing, I heard a voice. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, clearer with each passing moment. Come, join us. The voice echoed through the trees, a chorus of whispers, all calling out to me, beckoning me into the darkness. It was not a single voice, but many, all speaking in unison. The shadow behind me moved, its long limbs reaching out toward me, and that's when I realized there was no escape. The forest was alive, and it was hungry. The whispers echoed louder, filling my mind, drowning out everything else. The darkness seemed to close in tighter around me, suffocating me, pulling at the edges of my consciousness. I felt myself trembling, my legs barely able to hold me up, but I couldn't look away from the two figures closing in on me. The first, with its eyes burning like coals, and the second, its hollow gaze boring into my soul. Join us. The words repeated over and over, like a mantra that thrummed through my skull. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, my voice gone, swallowed by the overwhelming terror that consumed me. My mind screamed for me to move, to run, but my body refused to obey. The darkness was too thick, the weight of the forest too heavy. I was frozen in place, as if the very earth beneath me had come alive and was holding me down. Why am I here? The thought crashed through my mind, but I couldn't grasp it. It was like I was trapped in a nightmare where nothing made sense. My chest tightened as I looked from one figure to the other. The shadow with the glowing red eyes drew closer, its shape becoming more distinct. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its arms hung at strange angles, like they were too long for its body. There was no sound from its feet, no rustle of leaves, no breaking of twigs. It moved like a part of the forest, as if it had always been there, waiting. The second figure, the one with the hollow eyes, didn't move. It just stood there, watching me with that lifeless stare, unblinking, its face an empty canvas that sent a shiver of dread down my spine. The air around it felt colder, like the figure itself sucked warmth from the world, leaving only an icy void in its wake. They want me to join them. The realization was suffocating. They weren't just watching me, they were waiting for me to make a decision. A decision I knew I couldn't make. The voices grew louder, swirling around me. You are one of us now. You cannot escape. You will never leave. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But my mind was spinning, trapped in a loop of confusion and terror. I wanted to fight, to break free from the grip of the forest, but the weight of the shadows was too much. It was as if the trees themselves were reaching for me, their branches twisting and curling like fingers, pulling me deeper into the abyss. And then I felt it, a cold touch against my shoulder, like ice creeping into my skin. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. Only the shadows, thick and swirling around me, as if they were alive. No, no, no! I stumbled backward, tripping over a root that seemed to rise from the ground and fell hard onto the earth. The cold ground seeped through my clothes, biting into my skin, but it didn't matter. I couldn't feel anything anymore except for the pull of the darkness. The voices whispered from every direction now, becoming a maddening cacophony. Join us. The words echoed from every tree, from every shadow, from every inch of the forest. It was as if the entire place was alive, breathing with an ancient hunger. The shadow with the red eyes moved again, its long arms reaching out toward me. My heart skipped a beat as I realized it was no longer just an apparition. It was real. It was right there, so close now that I could see the twisted, inhuman features of its face, its mouth stretched in a grotesque, silent grin. I reached for my pocket, my trembling fingers brushing against the cold metal of my compass. I didn't know why I was holding onto it. It was just a tool, a simple thing to help find direction, but in that moment, it felt like the last link to the world I knew, the world that no longer felt real. I threw it down, watching it spin in the dirt, desperate for something, anything to ground me in this nightmare. But there was nothing. Only the ever-encroaching figures, the whispering voices, and the gnawing feeling that I was slipping away, fading into the shadows with every passing second. Help! The word finally broke free from my throat, but it sounded hollow, as though it was swallowed up by the forest itself. The figure with the hollow eyes stepped forward, its long, unnatural legs moving with a speed that shouldn't have been possible. It reached for me, its bony hand outstretched, and in that moment, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Behind the figure, something stirred. Another shadow. Darker, deeper, more malevolent than the others. It moved with a predatory grace, like a beast stalking its prey. My breath caught in my throat as I realized that there were more than just the two figures. The forest was alive with them. They were everywhere, and I had been walking straight into their trap. I am never leaving here. The thought was crystal clear, too clear, as if it had always been the truth. I had become part of the forest, part of the darkness. There was no escape, no hope. The shadows had claimed me, and I was destined to fade into them, to join the countless others who had wandered into these woods, only to vanish without a trace. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me whole were the glowing red eyes of the first figure, staring down at me, unblinking, as if it had been waiting for this moment. And then, everything went silent. The world went black. For a moment, I thought I was dead. The silence was suffocating, heavier than any fear I'd ever known. It was like the air had thickened, become a solid mass pressing down on me from all sides. My chest was tight, my body numb. I could feel nothing, no ground beneath me, no wind, no heartbeat. Only an unyielding, unnatural stillness. Was this what it felt like to be lost forever? The thought lingered in my mind, unanswered. My eyes were open, but there was nothing to see. It was as though I was floating in a void, untethered to any reality I'd ever known. Then, a sound broke the stillness. Faint at first, but growing louder with every passing second. The whisper. It came from all around me, like the wind itself had a voice. The voices, hundreds of them, all speaking in that same eerie, synchronized chorus. You belong. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. My body felt like it was made of stone. The sensation of being watched, of being surrounded, pressed in on me from all sides. And then, through the thick blackness, a light flickered. Weak, distant, but undeniable. I tried to focus on it, to reach for it, but it was always just out of my grasp. The more I struggled, the more it seemed to pull away, like some cruel game being played with me. The voices grew louder again, more insistent. You belong with us. Join us. I could feel them. Feel their presence, like hands brushing lightly over my skin. The air was cold, but not like the chill of the forest. It was colder, unnaturally so. And the shadows were everywhere. They weren't just shapes or forms now. They were alive, closing in on me, tightening their grip. I felt them creeping over me, curling around my legs, my arms, my neck, like cold, oppressive vines. No, this can't be happening. I need to wake up. But I couldn't wake up. I knew that now. I was beyond the point of escape. The whispers rose into a cacophony, drowning out all other thoughts, until they became one loud, overwhelming command. Stay. Suddenly, everything stopped. The voices, the shadows, the cold, they all disappeared, as though someone had pulled the plug from the world. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It was final. I opened my eyes, expecting to see the darkness, but instead, I saw only the shadows of the trees stretching long and twisted before me. I was back in the clearing. But something had changed. The forest was still there, looming all around me, but it wasn't the same. The trees no longer seemed just like trees. The shadows weren't just shadows. They were faces, countless faces that stared at me from the darkness. I could see their eyes now, red, glowing, unblinking, watching, waiting. I tried to move, to escape, but my legs felt like lead. The more I tried, the harder it became, as if the very ground was holding me in place. And then I heard it. The voice. A single whisper, soft and soothing. "You are one of us now." I tried to scream, but my throat was dry, empty. There was no sound. No more escape. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling, but something was wrong. They were different. My fingers were pale, thin, like the figures in the forest. And then, slowly, with a sickening jolt, I realized the truth. My reflection didn't match. I wasn't me anymore. The forest had claimed me, as it had claimed countless others before me. The darkness had swallowed me whole, and now I was a part of it. I had become just another shadow, just another face in the darkness, waiting for the next lost soul to wander into the clearing. There was no escape from the forest. There never had been. And as the shadows closed in around me, I understood. I would never leave. And neither would they. Forever. The Ghost Mountain of Tennessee. Have you heard about the Ghost Mountain in Tennessee? The question came up casually during our road trip as we were driving through the winding roads of the Smoky Mountains. My friend Jake, who was a seasoned hiker, had a habit of telling spooky tales, and I had always dismissed them as mere exaggerations. This one, however, seemed to carry a different weight. There was something in his voice, a tremor, a lingering doubt, that made me pause. Ghost Mountain? I repeated, glancing at him. What are you talking about? Jake's eyes narrowed as he glanced out the window at the towering mountain ridges surrounding us. They call it that because of the strange figures that show up on it at night. Climbers say they've seen shadows moving along the slopes. People swear they've seen figures of mountaineers, but they vanish with the dawn. Locals say they're the spirits of climbers who never made it to the top. I let out a small chuckle. You mean ghosts? I teased. Are we heading to a haunted mountain or a trail? Jake's lips tightened into a grin, but there was no humor in his eyes. People have gone up there, trying to prove it's just a trick of the light, but no one's come back the same. Some say the ghosts are stuck, forever trying to reach the peak they never did. Others believe they're warning the living, making sure no one else meets the same fate. It sounded like another one of Jake's wild stories, but as we continued our drive toward the base of the mountain, I couldn't shake off the chill that settled over me. The weather had taken a sudden turn, thick clouds gathered above us, blocking out the sun. The air felt dense and heavy, as if something was waiting to happen. Still, I shook it off. After all, it was just a mountain. Right? When we arrived at the trailhead, there was an eerie quietness about the place. The forest was thick with ancient trees, their gnarled branches twisting like bony fingers. It was already late afternoon, and the light was beginning to fade. The air had a crisp bite to it, typical of mountain regions, but there was something unnerving about the stillness. Jake grabbed his pack and motioned for me to do the same. "We'll camp tonight on the lower slopes. Tomorrow, we'll make the climb." I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I brushed it off as nerves. After all, what could happen on a mountain? As we ascended, the mountain grew steeper and the path became more rugged. The trees thinned out, giving way to jagged rock faces and sparse vegetation. The atmosphere was changing, as if the mountain itself was shifting, becoming more foreboding with every step we took. The whispering winds carried a strange, ghostly quality to them, like voices calling from the depths of the mountain. Jake moved ahead of me, his figure growing smaller as he scaled the rock face. I followed, though every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn back. I caught up with him as he paused at a narrow ridge. "We're almost there," he said, his voice distant. "This is where the figures are usually seen, at night." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "I thought you said it was just a story." Jake turned, offering a half smile. "Maybe it is. Or maybe there's something up here that we don't understand." We camped that night near the ridge, and as the hours passed, the mountain grew quiet again, unnaturally so. The wind had died down completely, leaving only the silence of the wilderness. I lay in my tent, trying to ignore the nagging feeling of being observed. Every so often, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I looked, there was nothing there. I drifted in and out of sleep, haunted by strange dreams, visions of shadowy figures climbing the mountain, their faces obscured by mist. I could hear whispers in the wind, unintelligible but urgent, as if they were warning me of something I couldn't quite grasp. At some point during the night, I woke with a start, my heart racing. There was something off. The air had grown colder, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. I pushed open the tent flap and looked out into the dark, searching the sloping ridges. At first, I thought it was a trick of the moonlight, but no. There, on the mountainside, I saw them. Figures, climbers, their shapes indistinct but unmistakable, moving with deliberate, slow steps across the jagged rocks. They were too far away to make out details, but I could see their outlines against the darkened landscape. And then, just as quickly as they had appeared, they were gone. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't explain it. They vanished before my eyes, disappearing into the darkness like phantoms, leaving no trace of their existence behind. "Jake," I whispered hoarsely, not daring to take my eyes off the ridge. But when he didn't answer, I turned to find the tent empty. A surge of panic shot through me. The shadows, the figures. They weren't just a story. They were real. I grabbed my flashlight, my hand shaking as I stumbled out of the tent, my mind racing. Where was Jake? The mountain felt alive, watching, waiting for something. And whatever it wasn't good. I scanned the dark landscape, my heart pounding as I stumbled through the rocky terrain. The flashlight beam flickered, casting unsettling shadows that twisted and stretched across the slopes. The air was colder now, almost unnatural, as if the mountain had become a frozen, breathing thing. The whispering wind had returned, but this time it carried something else, voices, faint but growing louder. They seemed to echo from all directions, indistinct yet filled with an urgency that sent chills down my spine. "Jake!" I called out, my voice cracking. No response. The path ahead was steep, the rocks slippery with moisture. I made my way toward the ridge where I had seen the figures, my footsteps echoing in the silence. My breath was visible in the air, clouds of vapor rising from my lips, but the chill in my bones was more than the temperature. It felt as though something was draining the warmth from within me. Every instinct told me to turn back, to return to the camp and wait for the morning light. But something kept me going, an invisible force that pulled me deeper into the mountain's heart. And then I saw them again, shadows moving along the ridge, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. The figures were climbing, their movements deliberate, almost mechanical. But there was no mistaking it now. They were not real climbers, they were phantoms, their outlines too vague, their steps too deliberate to be human. My heart skipped a beat as the flashlight flickered again, casting brief, sharp beams of light across the rock. For a split second, I saw one of the figures up close. Its face was a blur of shadows, but its eyes, dark, hollow, and endless, locked onto mine with a chilling intensity. I froze. My breath caught in my throat, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The figure didn't move, but its presence filled the air, suffocating me. I could feel its gaze, as if it were studying me, measuring my every move. I wanted to run, to flee back to the safety of the camp, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The figure slowly raised its hand, a skeletal gesture, pointing toward the summit. I swallowed hard. Was it trying to communicate? Was it trying to warn me? But before I could react, the figure vanished, just like the others, disappearing into the darkness as if it had never been there. The silence returned, thick and suffocating. I was alone again, standing in the cold, unfeeling night. I turned around, my mind racing. I had to find Jake. He couldn't have just disappeared. The rational part of my brain screamed that this was just a trick of the light, or perhaps some twisted hallucination brought on by exhaustion and fear. But deep down, I knew this mountain was not ordinary. There was something more here, something ancient and restless. As I made my way back down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle of the wind, every creak of the trees, every shadow that shifted in my peripheral vision made my skin crawl. The night felt alive, and it was closing in around me. I thought I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. Just the silent rocks and trees, still as death. But then I heard it again, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like the sound of boots against stone. My pulse quickened as I glanced over my shoulder, but once more, there was nothing. Jake! I shouted, desperation rising in my chest. There was no reply. The tapping continued, closer now, as if the footsteps were matching my own. I couldn't tell if they were real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. My flashlight flickered again, casting long, unnerving shadows across the rocks. I turned back to face the path ahead, my breath shallow and rapid. That's when I saw him. Jake. He was standing near the edge of the ridge, his back to me. His posture was stiff, unnatural, as if he were frozen in place. His body was silhouetted against the dark backdrop of the mountain, but his movements, slow, deliberate, and mechanical, made my stomach twist. Jake! I called, my voice trembling. He didn't turn, didn't acknowledge me. He simply stood there, staring out into the abyss of the mountain. Jake, what are you doing? Come back. I shouted, fear creeping into my voice. Without a word, Jake began to move, but it wasn't the way he usually walked. It was as if his body was being controlled by something else, each step unnervingly precise, as if he were following an unseen path that I couldn't see. His eyes were wide, unblinking, staring straight ahead. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I took a tentative step toward him, my legs shaky. "Jake!" I called out again, my voice breaking. "Jake, it's not you, is it?" He paused for a moment and then, slowly, turned his head. His face was pale, expressionless, and his eyes, there was something wrong with his eyes. They were empty, devoid of the familiar spark I had known for years. They were hollow, dark pools, as if they had seen something no living being should ever witness. "You have to go," he whispered in a voice that wasn't his. "It's too late for me." The wind howled around us, the air growing heavier with each passing second. The shadows on the mountain seemed to shift and writhe, like dark tendrils creeping down from the peak. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't Jake. It couldn't be. But before I could react, the ground beneath me shifted. A loud crack echoed through the air as the rocks beneath my feet gave way. My body was thrown forward, and I tumbled into the darkness, my scream lost in the vast, empty night. I didn't know what was happening anymore. I didn't know what was real or what was a nightmare. All I knew was that I was not alone. The mountain had claimed another victim. And the shadows, they were watching me, waiting for me to make the same mistake as so many others before me. I awoke with a violent jolt, my head pounding, my body bruised and battered. My vision was blurred, but I could see enough to realize I was lying at the bottom of a rocky crevasse, the cold air biting into my skin. The pain in my legs was sharp, a constant reminder that I had fallen from a great height. The world was spinning, but I forced myself to sit up, gritting my teeth against the nausea that rose in my throat. It took a few moments for my senses to clear, and when they did, the first thing I noticed was the silence. The wind, the sounds of the mountain, everything had stopped. It was as if the world had paused, holding its breath. I looked around, disoriented. The crevasse was deep, the jagged rocks rising like dark sentinels on all sides. My flashlight had fallen beside me, its beam weak and flickering, but still casting faint pools of light on the surrounding rocks. I reached for it, my fingers trembling, and turned it on. The light cut through the darkness, revealing the walls of the crevasse. The stones were slick with moisture, and the air had a strange, metallic taste. But there was something else, something more unsettling. The shadows, those same dark shapes I had seen before, were moving again, skittering along the edges of my vision. They were not just figments of my imagination anymore. They were real, or at least as real as anything could be in this cursed place. I stood up slowly, my knees shaking beneath me. Every muscle screamed in protest, but I forced myself to climb, using the rough walls of the crevasse for support. The shadows seemed to follow my every movement, closing in around me. They weren't just watching anymore, they were moving, reacting to me, circling. I wanted to scream, to run, but I had no idea where to go. The path above was now a distant memory, and the mountain had become a maze of confusion. The darkness pressed in, and I felt the weight of it, like a tangible force, suffocating me. Each step I took seemed to bring me deeper into the mountain's grip. I didn't know how long I had been climbing, but it felt like hours. The air grew colder with each passing moment, and the shadows seemed to grow stronger, more defined. They were taking shape, becoming figures that moved with purpose. I froze when I saw the first one, a tall, gaunt figure, its form flickering in and out of the shadows. It was standing at the edge of the crevasse, watching me. Its eyes, those same dark, hollow eyes, locked onto mine, and for a moment, I was paralyzed. I couldn't look away. The figure's face was a blur, a mass of shifting shadows, but its presence was overwhelming. It felt like it had always been there, waiting, watching. Then it began to move. Slow, deliberate steps, like a predator closing in on its prey. I gasped, scrambling backward, my heart racing. I had to get out of there. I had to escape. But every direction I looked, the shadows were there, growing in number, crowding the space around me. More figures were emerging from the darkness, their movements eerie and unnatural. They were the climbers. No, not climbers, not anymore. They were the ghosts of those who had failed to reach the summit, doomed to wander these cursed slopes for eternity. I tried to stand, to run, but my legs betrayed me. The pain in my limbs was unbearable, and I collapsed onto the cold, unforgiving stone. I could feel the weight of their eyes on me, the unrelenting pressure of their presence. "Jake," I whispered, my voice cracking. The figure from before, the one that had been my friend, was now just another shadow, moving among the others. His hollow eyes were locked on me, and for a fleeting moment, I saw a glimmer of recognition. But then it vanished, replaced by that same eerie emptiness. I realized, with growing horror, that I was no longer seeing Jake. I was seeing the ghosts of all the climbers who had died on this mountain, lost souls trapped in a never-ending cycle, doomed to wander these cursed slopes forever. And now, I was a part of that cycle. The figures closed in on me, their movements synchronized, as though they were all one. The air grew colder, and I could feel the weight of their cold gaze pressing in from all sides. They were real, not in the way I had always understood reality. They were something else, something beyond comprehension. And they were here for me. I had no choice but to scream, a sound that was swallowed by the vastness of the mountain. But it didn't matter. No one would hear me. No one could save me. The shadows were closing in, their forms becoming clearer, more solid, as if they were finally taking shape in this world. The mountain had claimed me, and now I was one of them, one of the lost, one of the doomed climbers who would never see the summit. And as I looked up, my breath catching in my throat, I realized that the summit, the place I had once dreamed of reaching, would never be reached. Not by me. Not by anyone. The mountain would always win. And in the end, it would claim all who dared to challenge it. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long, eerie shadows across the rocky slopes. It was almost dawn, and the figures of the lost climbers began to fade as the first light of day touched the mountain. The mountain had claimed its prize. But even as the light returned, the whispers lingered. They always did. I woke again, though I couldn't say how much time had passed. My limbs were numb, my body stiff, but there was no mistaking the feeling. Something was wrong. The air was heavier than before, as if the mountain itself was pressing down on me. The shadows had retreated, but I could still sense them, lurking just beyond the edges of my vision. I sat up, the cold stone beneath me digging into my skin. My head was a blur, and everything felt distant. The mountain had a way of warping your perception, I realized. The further you went into its heart, the less real everything became. The silence was thick, oppressive, and the world around me seemed to be holding its breath. And then I heard it. A faint whisper, almost imperceptible. It was the voice of someone I knew, Jake. But it wasn't his voice, not really. It was the same sound, the same cadence, but distorted, as though it were being spoken through a veil. The air around me shivered as the whisper grew louder, more urgent. "Get out of here, before it's too late." My heart skipped a beat. Was it Jake? Could he still be alive? My mind screamed at me to ignore the voice, to stand up, to run. But my body refused. It was as if I was paralyzed, unable to move, trapped in this waking nightmare. The whisper became clearer, more forceful, as if trying to break through the barrier of reality itself. Leave now, or stay forever. I turned, my eyes scanning the shadows around me, half expecting to see a figure, a form emerging from the darkness. But there was nothing but the cold, lifeless expanse of the mountain. I was alone. Or so I thought. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement. At first, it was just a flicker, a shift in the darkness, but as I turned to face it, the shape became more defined. A figure, tall, gaunt, with hollow eyes. It stepped into the weak light of the breaking dawn, and my blood ran cold. It was Jake, or what had once been Jake. His face was no longer human, distorted by the shadowy void that seemed to consume him. His body was an inhuman silhouette, his form flickering like a dying flame, but his eyes were still unmistakable. They were empty, lifeless, dead. "Jake," I whispered, my voice trembling. But the figure didn't respond. It merely stood there, its eyes locked onto mine, as if it were waiting for something. Waiting for me to understand. Suddenly, the air seemed to crackle with static. The ground beneath me trembled, and the shadows around me grew, stretching like living things, hungry and reaching. The mountain itself seemed to come alive, its walls shifting, its peaks looming closer. The summit was no longer a distant dream, it was an unreachable, foreboding presence, pushing me toward it, forcing me to climb higher, even though I knew I would never reach it. "Help me," I begged, my voice breaking. I didn't know who I was pleading to, Jake, the mountain, or myself. But I knew, deep down, that there was no escaping this place. The ghosts of the mountain were not just lost souls, they were part of the mountain itself, bound to it for eternity. And now, I was one of them. The shadow that was once Jake took a step forward, its form flickering with each movement. I could feel the coldness of it seep into my bones, the emptiness pressing down on me. My heart raced in terror, but I couldn't move. I couldn't escape. The mountain had already claimed me. "Join us," the figure whispered, its voice both Jake's and something else, something darker. "We were all lost here, and now you will be too." I felt a wave of cold wash over me, freezing me in place. The shadows closed in, their forms twisting and contorting as they encircled me. I could no longer tell where the mountain ended and the shadows began. The line between the living and the dead had blurred, and I was no longer sure which side I was on. As the last light of dawn faded, I realized that I had never truly been alone on this mountain. The figures, the lost climbers, had been with me all along, watching, waiting, preparing to claim me as one of their own. And now, I had become part of the mountain's curse. The final thing I saw was Jake's eyes, empty and cold, before everything went dark. The mountain stood silent as ever, its towering peaks shrouded in mist. But if you listened closely, you might hear the whispers, the faintest echoes of those who had come before. The spirits of the fallen climbers were never truly gone, they lingered in the shadows, waiting for the next soul to wander too close to the cursed summit. And so the mountain waits. Forever. The Red Lake of Minnesota. It's said that once you've been on Red Lake long enough, you start to see things. That's what the locals always warn you. They talk about the strange figures that emerge from the water as the sun sets, the ghostly silhouettes of people who seem to be floating on the surface, half human, half illusion. Some say they are the souls of those lost to the lake long ago, wandering its depths, forever trapped in a never-ending search for escape. I didn't believe it at first. My name is Ryan, and I've been fishing on Red Lake for years. It's not a big spot in the grand scheme of things, but it's quiet, remote. The kind of place you go when you want to get away from the noise of the world. A perfect place to fish alone, think, and just be. That's how I ended up there last summer, just as the last of the daylight was slipping behind the horizon. I'd taken my boat out, like I did most evenings. The weather was clear, and the lake's surface was like glass, calm, undisturbed. I rowed out to my favorite spot, far from the shore, where the water was deep and dark. I cast my line and waited. At first, it was just the usual quiet. The faint splash of water as my line settled. The distant call of birds somewhere in the trees. The steady rhythm of my oars moving through the water. It was peaceful. But then, I saw something. It was so subtle at first that I thought I was imagining it, like a trick of the light. A shadow on the surface, just beyond my boat. I paused, staring at it. The shadow seemed to shift, moving slowly along the water. I blinked and it was gone. I shrugged it off. Probably a fish or a bit of driftwood. Nothing to worry about. But then it happened again. A figure rising from the water, just visible under the surface. For a moment, I thought it was a person, someone out there, perhaps a fellow fisherman who had drifted too far. But as the shape took form, I realized it wasn't a person at all. It was something else. Something wrong. The figure wasn't moving the way a person would. It was floating, hovering just above the surface of the water, like a ghost. At first, it appeared to be the faint outline of a man, tall, with a wide-brimmed hat and a long coat. But as I stared, the details began to blur, distorting into something less human. The figure had no legs, no distinct features, just a silhouette, a dark patch against the shimmering surface of the lake. I felt a chill creep up my spine, and instinctively, I started to row back toward the shore. My hands gripped the oars harder, my breath coming faster, but the figure, it didn't move. It just stayed there, suspended in the water, staring back at me. Or at least, that's what it felt like. Then, a sound broke the silence, a scream. A high-pitched, strangled cry that echoed across the lake. It was the kind of sound that made your skin crawl, the kind of scream you couldn't ignore, no matter how hard you tried. I froze. The scream faded as quickly as it had come, and all that was left was the same strange figure, still floating in the water. But now, it wasn't alone. Another figure had joined it. And then another. The surface of the lake was filling with them, shadows rising from the depths, silent, motionless, watching. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And just as quickly as they had appeared, the figures vanished, sinking back into the water without a sound. I glanced around, expecting to see something, anything, but the lake was calm again. The water was smooth, undisturbed, as if nothing had ever happened. But the unease lingered. I pulled my boat back toward the shore as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. The eerie silence seemed to press in on me, suffocating. As I neared the shore, I caught a glimpse of something in the water, a face. It was pale, with hollow eyes and lips parted in a silent scream. It was only there for a moment before it vanished beneath the surface. I didn't stay to see what else might emerge. I was back at my cabin before I even realized what I was doing, my hands trembling as I locked the door behind me. The faces, the figures, they were all I could think about. What had I seen out there? Was it real? Or had the isolation of the lake finally gotten to me? I didn't know. But I knew one thing for sure. I would never go back to Red Lake at night again. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what had happened. I convinced myself it was just a trick of the mind, that the figures were nothing more than a figment of my imagination, brought on by fatigue or the creeping darkness. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. And that's when I heard it again. A faint sound, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. A scream. It was coming from the lake. I tried to ignore it. I told myself that it was nothing, just the wind playing tricks, or perhaps an animal, something natural. But as the hours passed, the scream didn't fade. It lingered in the distance, a soft wail carried by the night air, like a distant cry for help. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was coming from the lake. It was too familiar, too real. And worse, it sounded as though it was calling me, drawing me back. I paced around the cabin, unable to sleep. My mind raced, each thought more tangled than the last. The figures I had seen on the water weren't normal. They couldn't have been. I'd been fishing for years, and I'd never seen anything like it. They were too real, too tangible, even though they weren't. By morning, the sun had risen, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and orange. The lake was still, its surface calm, as though nothing had happened during the night. The sounds had stopped. It almost felt like a dream. But I knew better. I couldn't shake the image of the figure from my mind, the way it hovered over the water, its dark outlines so strange and unnerving. The screams had come from somewhere, and they weren't just in my head. Something was out there. I couldn't leave without knowing the truth. Despite the growing unease in my gut, I made up my mind. I would return to the lake. Not tonight, but during the day. I'd take my boat out again, but this time I'd go closer to the area where I had seen the figures. Maybe I could explain it all, figure out if there was a logical reason for what had happened. I set out mid-afternoon. The air was warm, the kind of early summer warmth that should have been comforting. But as I paddled out toward the middle of the lake, the familiar peace I had always felt there seemed to fade, replaced by a sense of foreboding that grew heavier with each stroke of the oars. The place where I had seen the figures was just ahead, so I steered the boat in that direction. The surface of the water seemed unusually dark here, almost unnaturally so. I told myself it was just the depth of the lake, nothing more. But when I reached the spot, I paused. The water was perfectly still, and for a moment there was nothing. No movement, no sounds, just the quiet. But then, as I stared into the dark expanse below, I saw something, a shape, faint at first, but unmistakable. It was a hand. Or at least, it looked like a hand. I froze. My pulse quickened. The hand was slowly rising from the water, pale and limp, like a drowned person trying to claw their way up. I could see fingers, thin and long, stretching toward the surface, reaching for something, or perhaps for me. I leaned forward, trying to get a closer look, my heart pounding in my chest. The hand was joined by another, and another. Slowly, figures began to emerge from the water, their forms twisting and undulating as they broke the surface. They weren't solid, more like shadows, half-formed and translucent, but they were unmistakable. There were at least 5 of them, all reaching toward me, their faces a blur of distorted features. And then I heard it, the scream, louder this time, as though it was coming from the depths themselves, a sound so raw and full of anguish that it made my blood run cold. It was the scream of someone who had been lost for a long time, someone who was trapped. I couldn't breathe. My hands gripped the oars so tightly they hurt, but I couldn't move. The figures didn't approach, but they didn't retreat either. They just stayed there, suspended in the water, staring at me with eyes that were more shadow than substance. I tried to rationalize it. I thought maybe they were just reflections, tricks of the light, some kind of natural phenomenon. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. These weren't just shadows or reflections. These were things. Things that shouldn't be. I rowed backwards slowly, trying not to make a sound. I didn't want to disturb them, didn't want to provoke whatever they were. But the water was so still, the silence so complete, that even the faintest movement felt like a breach. I could feel their presence, their eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them anymore. Then, without warning, the figures lunged toward the boat. Their arms stretched out, reaching for me with unnatural speed, their hands grasping at the air, at the water. The scream came again, louder this time, right beside my ear. I snapped the oars into action, paddling as hard as I could. My heart was racing, my chest tight with fear. I glanced over my shoulder, nothing. The figures had disappeared again, but I could feel them, feel their presence lingering in the air, watching, waiting. I didn't look back again. I didn't dare. As I made my way back to shore, I tried to convince myself that it wasn't real. That it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep inside, I knew better. There was something wrong with that lake, something beyond explanation. Something that was waiting for anyone foolish enough to venture too close. And now, I was certain I wasn't alone on Red Lake. I was being watched. That night, I didn't sleep. The silence in the cabin was suffocating. The faint sounds of the lake, the same eerie stillness I had grown accustomed to over the years, seemed to creep inside, wrapping around me like a cold blanket. Every small noise, a creak from the floorboards, the wind pushing against the windows, felt amplified, like a warning. I kept thinking about the figures in the water. Those pale hands. The faces, twisted and distorted, staring at me. I couldn't get their eyes out of my mind, dark and hollow, yet strangely knowing, as if they had seen everything I had ever done. The scream echoed in my mind, a sound I couldn't shake. It felt like it was coming from the very depths of the lake, from some unfathomable place beneath the surface. It wasn't just a scream, it was a cry for help, a desperate plea for someone to listen. And in my heart, I knew that someone had to listen. The next morning, I found myself standing by the shore again. The sun was up, but the lake still seemed off, like it hadn't fully woken from some dark, slumbering nightmare. The water was calm, too calm, and the air had a heavy, oppressive quality. I thought about leaving. The sensible part of me screamed to pack up and go. I had already seen enough to convince me that whatever was on that lake wasn't natural. But the other part of me, the part that was still haunted by those figures, couldn't leave without understanding what was going on. I needed answers. I needed to know what was happening. I rented a boat again, this time bringing a flashlight and a couple of extra supplies, just in case. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, but the need to know the truth, to face whatever it was on the lake, was overwhelming. This time, I stayed further away from the spot where I had seen the figures. I tried to be cautious, not wanting to provoke anything. But as I paddled across the water, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pulled towards something. There was a current, but it wasn't a physical one. It was as if the lake itself was calling to me, guiding me. I could feel it in my bones, the weight of the lake, the ancient presence beneath the water. Something had changed. Something had noticed me. As I reached the middle of the lake, I stopped paddling. The boat drifted, as though it were being held in place by some unseen force. Then it happened. A ripple, barely noticeable at first, spread across the surface of the water. It was too smooth, too unnatural. And then it became a wave, a slow, deliberate wave, like something moving beneath. My heart skipped a beat. I swung the flashlight in a wide arc, the beam cutting through the dimming light of late afternoon, but I saw nothing. Just the same empty expanse of water. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, just a silhouette at first, emerged from the water. It was standing on the surface, not sinking, not struggling. It just stood there, impossibly tall, cloaked in darkness. I could barely make out its form, but it was unmistakable. Another figure. I held my breath, watching as it moved closer. It wasn't walking, it was floating, gliding above the water like a ghostly apparition. And there, just below it, I saw the others. Dozens of them. They weren't rising from the depths like before. Now, they were already there, hovering, standing on the water as if the lake had somehow become their domain. I froze, unable to look away. The air had grown colder, the wind picking up as if to warn me. But I couldn't move, couldn't make a sound. I could feel my body trembling, my hands gripping the sides of the boat so tightly that my knuckles ached. The figures grew clearer, their outlines sharp and defined, yet still unnervingly hollow. They had no faces, just dark, empty spaces where their eyes should have been. One of them reached toward me, and I saw a flash of pale skin under the water, its arm extending with unnatural speed. It was the same hand I had seen before, the same long, bony fingers reaching for me, grasping for something that was not there. The others were closing in. I could hear the soft splash of water, the faint sound of movement from all directions. And then came the scream again. It was loud now, right beside me, as though someone was screaming into my ear, their voice full of rage and pain. I couldn't take it anymore. I snapped out of my trance-like state and began rowing, fast and furious, my arms burning from the effort. I didn't care if I tipped the boat over, I just needed to get away from them. The figures didn't follow me, but I could feel them, feel their eyes on my back as I paddled desperately toward the shore. When I finally made it back, gasping for air, my legs shaky beneath me, the figures were gone. The lake was still again. Silent. But I knew they were there, just beneath the surface, waiting. Waiting for someone else to come too close. Waiting for me to return. And deep inside, I knew that I couldn't leave. Not yet. Not until I understood what they wanted. The days that followed were a blur. I stayed in the cabin, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching me, lurking just beyond my line of sight. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind against the walls, felt like a signal, a reminder of the lake's dark presence. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, the hollow, empty eyes staring at me from the depths. The locals were no help. When I asked about the strange happenings on the lake, they just shrugged, offering half-hearted explanations about currents or strange refractions in the water. But I could tell they were hiding something. The fear in their eyes when they spoke of the lake told me all I needed to know. They weren't just dismissing me, they were scared. I couldn't let it go. I had to go back. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood at the water's edge, watching the waves lap against the shore. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The lake, dark and still, seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. I felt a pull, a magnetic force that seemed to call me to the water. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed into the boat once again. The familiar weight of the oars in my hands felt oddly comforting. This time, I wasn't going to let fear control me. I had to know the truth. I rowed further out into the lake, farther than I had ever gone before. The water was dark, almost black in the moonlight, reflecting the sky like a mirror. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see those figures already behind me, but there was nothing. Just the stillness of the water and the distant hum of insects. Then, I heard it. A soft sound, barely audible at first, but growing louder. A faint, almost melodic whisper carried on the wind. I paused, listening intently, but the words were too distorted, too far away to make sense of. It was as if the sound was coming from beneath the surface. I had no choice but to keep going. The lake felt different now, alive in a way that was almost suffocating. Every stroke of the oars brought me deeper into its heart, and the silence around me felt more oppressive. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat matching the rhythm of the row. And then, without warning, I saw them. Not in the distance this time. They were right in front of me. Figures emerged from the water, rising slowly, like phantoms emerging from the depths. Their forms were less clear now, more solid, but still indistinct, like shadows of something half forgotten. They hovered above the water, their bodies rippling as if the air itself had become thick with their presence. One of them, taller than the rest, moved toward me, its form sharp and defined. It was a woman, or at least it looked like one, her face pale and gaunt, her hair floating around her like seaweed. Her eyes were wide open, staring at me with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. She spoke. Her voice was like the wind, faint but clear. "Help us." The words were soft, pleading, but they carried a weight I couldn't ignore. I froze, unable to respond. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was this a trick? Were these figures real? Or was I losing my grip on reality? I reached for the oars, trying to push the boat away from them, but it was as if the water had grown thicker, resisting my every move. I could feel the pull, a constant tug that threatened to drag me down. "Please," the woman whispered again, her voice tinged with desperation. "We need to reach the shore. We need to rest." The others were closing in now, their bodies swirling in the water like mist. They were all around me, their faces twisting in agony, their hands reaching out toward me. I could see them now, the men and women who had drowned, their expressions frozen in a permanent state of terror. They were not just haunting the lake, they were trapped in it, forever bound to its depths, unable to find peace. And they wanted me to help them. But how could I? What could I possibly do for them? The boat lurched suddenly, and I was thrown off balance. I looked down to see water creeping over the sides, rising up fast as if the lake itself was swallowing me whole. I had to escape. With all my strength, I shoved the oars into the water and began rowing with desperate speed. The figures were still coming, the whispering voices growing louder, their pleas echoing in my head. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't stay. The water surged beneath me, pulling at the boat, and the air grew colder, the wind howling in my ears. The figures were right behind me now, their faces just inches from mine. I could feel their cold breath on my skin, their hands brushing against the boat. I rowed faster, pushing myself harder, my muscles burning with the effort. The shore was getting closer, but it felt like an eternity. The figures were relentless, following me, never letting me get far enough away. And then, just as I reached the shore, I felt it. A hand, cold and clammy, grasped my wrist, pulling me back. I gasped and jerked my arm away, my heart racing. I reached the land, stumbling out of the boat, and collapsed onto the grass. The figures didn't follow. They stopped at the edge of the water, just out of reach. I lay there, gasping for breath, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. I looked back at the lake, but the figures had vanished. The water was still again, as if nothing had ever occurred. But I knew better. I had heard their voices. I had felt their touch. The lake had claimed them, and now it wanted me too. I could leave, but the pull of the lake would always be there. Waiting. The morning came, cold and unyielding. I lay in the grass, feeling as though my body had been through a storm, bruised and battered by the unseen hands that had almost dragged me under. My clothes were soaked, my mind racing with images of the figures, those pale, tortured souls who still wandered beneath the water's surface. They had wanted me to help, but what could I have done? I couldn't even save myself. As I stumbled to my feet, the weight of the night seemed to press down on me. The air was thick with an eerie silence, a stillness that felt unnatural. I wanted to run, to flee the lake and its haunting presence, but something told me that I couldn't escape so easily. The lake, the figures, the pull, they had already marked me. I made my way back to the cabin, every step feeling like a betrayal to the voices I had left behind. They were still there, in the back of my mind, whispering, pleading, always reaching for me. It was like a thread pulling me back to the water, a connection I couldn't sever no matter how hard I tried. Inside the cabin, I found myself staring at the walls, wondering how much of the night had been real. Could it have been a dream? Could I have imagined the cold hands, the tortured faces, and the desperate cries? I knew the answer. It hadn't been a dream. It was real. The whispers grew louder in my mind, as if the lake itself was calling me back. I tried to ignore them, to block out the memories, but it was impossible. The lake wasn't done with me. It would never let me go. I glanced at the clock. The sun had risen fully, casting a harsh light through the windows. But even in the daylight, I could feel the pull. There was a darkness in that lake, something older than time itself, something that didn't belong. I knew I had to leave, but the idea of running felt impossible. The lake would follow me wherever I went. It was already inside me. As the days wore on, I became more and more isolated, trapped in my own mind, consumed by the memories of that night. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, watching me from the shadows, waiting for me to return. The lake had claimed them, and now it wanted me to join them. But I couldn't give in. I wouldn't. One night, unable to sleep, I found myself standing by the cabin's window, staring at the lake. The surface was calm, the moonlight reflecting off the water like glass. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something move, a figure rising from the depths, emerging like a ghostly silhouette. My breath caught in my throat. It was them. They were still there, and they were waiting. With a sudden, overwhelming compulsion, I grabbed my keys and headed out the door. I couldn't stay. I couldn't let the lake have me. Not like it had taken them. I ran toward the boat, my heart pounding in my chest. The wind whipped around me, the air growing colder the closer I got to the water. As I reached the edge of the lake, The boat bobbed gently in the water, just as it had the first time. The boat was still there, waiting for me, just as I had left it. And then, in the moonlight, I saw her. The figure. The woman. She was standing by the water's edge, her pale face staring at me with those empty, sorrowful eyes. Her lips moved, and I could hear her voice again, faint but clear, carried on the wind. "You can't escape." I froze, paralyzed by the sight of her. The cold had returned, seeping into my bones, dragging me into the depths of the lake. The water rose again, swirling around my feet, pulling me toward it. The woman took a step forward, and I could feel her presence drawing me in. The pull was unbearable. It was as though the lake was reaching for me, claiming me like it had claimed all the others before me. I tried to back away, but the water surged higher, lapping at my legs, wrapping around my body like a vice. The boat was still there, but it no longer felt like a means of escape. It was a trap. The woman took another step, her figure growing clearer in the mist. She reached out, her fingers long and skeletal, and I knew what she wanted. She wanted me to join her. "Please," she whispered. "We need you." I felt myself slipping, sinking into the water, my body growing heavy with the weight of the lake. The moonlight seemed to fade, and the surface of the lake grew darker, as if it were swallowing the light itself. My heart raced, but there was no fight left in me. I had no strength to pull myself away from the suffocating cold. As the water rose above my head, I heard their voices, dozens of them, hundreds, all calling to me. The lake had claimed them, and now it was claiming me. With one final, desperate breath, I sank beneath the surface. The last thing I saw was the woman's face, her eyes empty and hollow, as she reached out to welcome me into the depths. And then, there was nothing. Only darkness. The next morning, the sun rose over the lake once again, its golden light dancing across the surface. The boat bobbed gently in the water, as still as the rest of the world around it. And if anyone had been there to look, they might have seen the faintest ripple just beyond the edge of the water. But there was no one left to see. The lake waits, as it always has, for those who wander too close. And once it has them, it never lets go. Weird Hitchhiker from Alabama. It was a late autumn evening in Alabama, the sun barely hanging onto the horizon as it dipped behind the dense, dark woods. I was driving down a long stretch of highway, the kind that seemed to stretch forever with no signs of life except for the occasional passing car. The road was quiet, a little too quiet for comfort. I had just finished a long day of work and was eager to get home, but there was something about the road that night that felt off, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. That's when I saw him. A figure standing by the roadside, hand raised, a thumb out, the universal sign for a ride. It wasn't unusual to see hitchhikers out there, but there was something strange about this one. His clothes were worn, dusty, like he'd been walking for days. But what caught my attention was his face, pale, almost too pale. His hair was long and matted, and he didn't seem to be moving much, just standing there, staring down the road. I slowed the car as I approached. There was no one else around, no lights, no houses for miles. Just the winding road and the figure standing in the fading light. I hesitated. Should I stop? Should I keep driving? Something told me to keep going, but my curiosity got the better of me. I pulled over, the gravel crunching beneath the tires as I stopped beside him. "Hey," I called out, trying to gauge his mood. "You need a ride?" The hitchhiker didn't respond right away. He just stared at me, his eyes wide and distant, like he wasn't really seeing me at all. After a long pause, he finally nodded slowly, and then, without a word, climbed into the passenger seat. The moment he settled in, the air in the car seemed to grow heavier. The temperature dropped, just slightly, enough to make me shiver. I tried to start a conversation. "Where are you headed?" I asked, keeping my eyes on the road. He didn't answer. It was as if he hadn't even heard me. The silence between us stretched out, thick and uncomfortable, only broken by the sound of the tires on the pavement. A few minutes passed, and I started to feel a growing unease. The air in the car felt cold now, the kind of cold that sinks deep into your bones. It wasn't like the typical chill of autumn. This felt different, like it had a life of its own. And yet, the hitchhiker remained silent, his face turned towards the window, his hands folded in his lap. He didn't even seem to be looking at anything in particular. Just staring. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye, but he didn't seem to notice. It was as if he was somewhere far away, lost in his own thoughts, or maybe lost in something else entirely. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The silence between us had grown thick, suffocating. After a while, I couldn't take it anymore. "You okay?" I asked, trying to break the silence. "Where are you going?" Still, no response. Just the faintest sound of his breath, shallow and steady. The car's engine hummed as we sped along the dark highway, but in that quiet cabin, the silence was deafening. I glanced at him again, but this time, something was different. His posture had shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, as though he was now more alert, more aware of his surroundings. But his eyes, they were no longer just staring blankly out the window. They were fixed on me now, those pale eyes, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. "Hey," I said, my voice coming out shakier than I intended. "Are you all right?" He didn't respond, but the faintest trace of a smile played at the corners of his lips. A smile that wasn't quite right. It was unsettling, as though he knew something I didn't, something I wasn't supposed to know. I turned my eyes back to the road, my grip on the steering wheel tightening. The silence had become unbearable, the air in the car heavier with each passing mile. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something about this hitchhiker, about the whole situation, felt wrong. Every instinct in me was screaming to pull over and get out of the car, but I couldn't. I was too far from any town, and there was no one else on the road. Then, as we drove further into the night, I began to notice something strange. A faint smell, like smoke, began to linger in the car. At first, it was subtle, just a whiff here and there, but soon it became impossible to ignore. The scent grew stronger, thickening the air. It was a kind of burning smell, like something was smoldering, and I couldn't figure out where it was coming from. I looked around the car, checking the dashboard, the vents, trying to locate the source. But there was nothing. No fire, no sign of anything burning. Yet the smell persisted, curling into my nostrils, making my head spin. I glanced at the hitchhiker. His eyes were still on me, and now there was something else in his expression. A look of satisfaction? I wasn't sure. But I knew one thing for certain, I had to get away from him. I had to stop the car. But before I could say anything, the figure shifted in his seat, letting out a low, almost imperceptible sigh. It was like he was stretching, preparing for something. And then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. No sound, no movement, nothing. I turned to the passenger seat, and it was empty. The cold air lingered, and the smell of smoke was still heavy in the cabin. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing in my chest. The car screeched to a halt in the middle of the road, the headlights casting long shadows in the night. I opened the door, stepping out onto the asphalt. I looked around, but there was no sign of him. No footprints, no trace of where he might have gone. I was alone on the highway, my breath coming in shallow gasps, my mind reeling. What had just happened? Was I imagining it? But I couldn't deny the evidence, the lingering smell of smoke, the chill in the air, and the heavy silence that had settled over the road. I climbed back into the car, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. There was only one thing I knew for sure now. I would never, ever pick up a hitchhiker again. The drive back home was a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, lurking just outside my vision. The highway stretched out in front of me, endless and empty, but the night felt too quiet, too still. It was as if the world had stopped moving, holding its breath in anticipation. I kept my eyes on the road, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. I could still feel the cold air in the car, even though the heat was blasting at full force. The smell of smoke lingered, faint but persistent, curling into my nostrils and making my stomach churn. I couldn't get rid of it, no matter how many windows I rolled down or how many breaths of fresh air I took. I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe I had been too tired, too worn out from the day's work. Maybe I had imagined the hitchhiker disappearing. Maybe the smell was just a trick of my mind, a result of the long drive and the stress. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just my imagination. Something had happened, something I couldn't explain. As I drove, my mind raced. I thought about the hitchhiker's pale face, the eerie smile that hadn't quite belonged, the coldness that had settled in the car after he got in. I thought about how he hadn't spoken a single word, not a single syllable. And when he disappeared, it was as if he had never existed at all. No trace, no sign, nothing. Just the smell of smoke and the emptiness left behind. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the hitchhiker hadn't just disappeared from the car, he had disappeared from the world. There had been no road signs, no other cars around. No one else had seen him. It was as if he had never been there at all, like he had been a ghost. I tried to push the thought out of my mind. I told myself it was just some strange occurrence, nothing more. But the unease in my chest wouldn't go away. I couldn't escape the feeling that I had encountered something far darker than I understood. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun was beginning to rise, casting a dim light over the trees and the quiet suburban street. I parked the car and sat there for a moment, staring at the house, trying to calm my racing thoughts. My hands were still shaking as I gripped the door handle. I stepped out of the car and walked to the front door, feeling as though I were being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing. Only the quiet morning and the rustling of leaves in the wind. As I stepped inside, I noticed something strange. The air felt different. The house was warmer than I remembered, but it wasn't the usual comfort of home. It was thick, heavy, like the air inside had changed since I left. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it felt suffocating. I shook off the sensation and tried to go about my day, but it wasn't the same. I couldn't stop thinking about the hitchhiker, about the coldness and the smoke, about the way he had vanished without a trace. I kept replaying the moment in my mind, trying to find an explanation. But no matter how many times I thought about it, the answers never came. The days passed, but the unease never left me. Every time I got into the car, I kept an eye on the side of the road, half expecting to see the hitchhiker standing there again. But there was nothing, no figure, no sign of him, no trace that he had ever been there. Yet, the smell of smoke, it lingered. Not just in the car, but in the house, in my clothes, in my hair. It was as though the scent had attached itself to me, following me no matter where I went. One evening, I decided to drive out again to the same stretch of highway where I had picked him up. I needed answers. Maybe I had missed something, maybe there was a logical explanation. I had to know. The drive felt different this time, more oppressive, like the air itself was closing in around me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the trees, from the road. Every mile seemed to stretch longer, every turn more uncertain. When I reached the spot where I had picked up the hitchhiker, I slowed the car to a stop. The road was empty, just as it had been that night. I stepped out, looking around, but there was nothing. No sign of him, no trace that he had ever been there. I stood there for a moment, the wind rustling through the trees, but then, just as I was about to turn back, the unmistakable scent of smoke filled the air. It was faint at first, but it grew stronger, heavier, until it surrounded me. I turned, and there, standing by the side of the road, was the hitchhiker. His face was as pale as I remembered, his eyes wide and unblinking, staring straight at me. But this time, he wasn't just standing still. He was moving toward me, slowly, deliberately, with no sound at all. I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. The smell of smoke was choking me now, and I felt the coldness creeping back into the air. The hitchhiker stopped just a few feet away, his face inches from mine. He didn't speak, but his smile, it was that same unsettling, knowing smile, the one that made my skin crawl. And then, just like before, he was gone. Vanished into thin air, without a sound. I didn't stick around to wait for anything else. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I didn't care to find out what was going to happen next. I got back in the car and drove off, faster than I had ever driven in my life. I couldn't look back, but I could feel his presence lingering, following me, as if he were waiting for me to make one mistake. I never drove that highway again. I never picked up another hitchhiker. And the smell of smoke, it never really went away. It stayed with me, a constant reminder of that night and the ghostly figure that still haunted me, no matter where I went. And every time I drive, I keep my eyes on the side of the road, because I know one thing for certain, he's out there. Waiting. Days turned into weeks, and yet I couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching me. The strange events that unfolded with the hitchhiker didn't seem like something that would just fade away. I felt trapped in a never-ending cycle of fear, my every movement shadowed by the unshakable presence of the unknown. At work, I found it hard to focus. My colleagues noticed the change in me, how I was jumpy, how my eyes would dart to every corner of the room as if expecting something to appear. I'd catch myself staring out the window, half expecting to see the hitchhiker standing there in the distance, his cold eyes fixed on me. It wasn't just the smell of smoke anymore. It was in the air, on my clothes, in the corners of my apartment, on my skin. It clung to me, a constant reminder of that night. I had tried everything to get rid of it, from washing my clothes repeatedly to using air fresheners in my car, but nothing worked. The smell would return, stronger each time, as though it had found a permanent place in my life. Then, one evening, as I was driving home after work, I saw him again. This time, it was in the reflection of my rearview mirror. I wasn't sure if I had really seen him, but my heart skipped a beat. I glanced at the mirror, but there was no one behind me. I looked again, my grip tightening on the wheel. In the faint glow of my headlights, there was a figure standing at the side of the road, just like before. His face was too pale, too still. It was him, the hitchhiker. I felt my throat tighten, my stomach twisting in knots. I had to look away. The road stretched ahead, but my mind was racing, the fear overwhelming me. I was caught in this loop, unable to break free. I sped up, praying I would get past the spot without encountering him. As I passed the location, I couldn't help myself. I glanced back in the mirror one last time, and there he was, standing still in the same place, watching me. I quickly turned my eyes back to the road, but the chill in the air was unmistakable. The temperature in the car had dropped, and the familiar scent of smoke filled my nose. It felt like he was there, right beside me in the car. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, but my body was frozen. I had to get home. I had to get away. But every turn, every stretch of the road felt like it was getting longer. The shadows around me seemed to stretch unnaturally, and the quiet hum of the tires on the asphalt turned into a low, distant whisper, like voices just out of reach. I looked at my hands gripping the steering wheel, white-knuckled, and then at the road ahead, but nothing seemed real anymore. Suddenly, the whispering grew louder, filling the car. It was as though the voices were right there, in the back seat, behind me, speaking in low, unintelligible murmurs. My heart thudded in my chest as I glanced into the rearview mirror once again. But this time, the hitchhiker wasn't in the reflection. Instead, there were faces. Dozens of them, ghostly pale, distorted by some unknown force, their eyes wide with silent screams. Their mouths opened, but no sound came. They were trapped in the mirror, reaching toward me. I slammed on the brakes, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my mind unraveling. But when I looked again, the mirror was empty. The voices stopped. The coldness in the air vanished. I didn't know what to think, what to feel anymore. My grip on reality was slipping. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pulled into something I couldn't escape. I didn't know if I was losing my mind or if the hitchhiker was really out there, always watching, always waiting. When I reached my apartment, I didn't even bother to turn off the engine. I just ran inside, locking the door behind me, my mind racing. I couldn't stay there any longer. I knew I couldn't. But I also knew that the hitchhiker, whatever he was, would find me again. It wasn't over. I had somehow been marked, chosen to be a part of something I didn't understand. And there was nothing I could do to stop it. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, pale, silent, and always smiling. His cold eyes followed me in my dreams, and when I woke, I could feel his presence in the room just beyond my reach. I began to question everything. Had I really picked up a hitchhiker? Or had something else been in that car with me, something beyond explanation? Was I losing my mind, or was I being haunted by something that had no explanation? I didn't have the answers, and I wasn't sure I ever would. But one thing was certain, I couldn't escape him. The hitchhiker was always there, waiting for me to return. I couldn't tell what was real anymore. The line between nightmares and waking life had blurred so completely that I had no idea how to distinguish one from the other. The hitchhiker had become a part of my reality, haunting every moment, every breath. I could almost feel his cold, ghostly presence next to me, his hollow eyes always following my every move. I didn't leave my apartment for days. I was afraid to drive. Afraid that if I stepped outside, he'd be there waiting for me, like a shadow I couldn't escape. I started to lose track of time, my world shrinking to the four walls around me. The smell of smoke was constant, lingering on my clothes, my skin, my very thoughts. It wasn't just in my car anymore, it was everywhere. But one day, the urge to get out, the need to escape my apartment, overcame me. I needed to feel the world beyond these walls, to convince myself that I hadn't completely lost my mind. I decided to take a drive, just a short one. Maybe if I could just get away for a little while, the tension would ease. The moment I turned the key in the ignition, the car seemed to tremble with the same coldness that had taken over my life. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though the seat next to me was empty. As I pulled out of my apartment complex and onto the main road, a thick fog rolled in, just as it had the night I first met the hitchhiker. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself that it was just a coincidence. But deep down, I knew better. The dread had settled back into my chest, and every turn I made felt like I was heading towards something I couldn't avoid. I passed familiar landmarks, gas stations, diners, places I'd driven by 100 times, but they all looked different now, as though they were part of a dream I couldn't wake from. I reached the stretch of road where I picked up the hitchhiker, and the memories came rushing back. My pulse quickened, my grip on the wheel tightened. I glanced to the side of the road, half expecting to see him there. But there was no sign of him, just the thick fog swirling around the pavement. I took a deep breath, telling myself it was over, that I was being paranoid. But then I saw him. He was standing there, by the shoulder, as though he had been waiting for me. His pale face was barely visible through the fog, but I knew it was him, the same hitchhiker I had picked up weeks ago. His hand was raised, just like before, beckoning me to stop. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to keep driving, to speed away, but my body refused to listen. I was drawn to him, like a moth to a flame. Against my better judgment, I slowed the car and pulled over. When I stopped, I didn't see him immediately. The fog had grown thick, swallowing everything around me. My hands were shaking as I reached for the door handle, but I couldn't move. The air in the car had grown cold again, colder than it should have been for a warm night. The smell of smoke hit me with full force, choking me, making my eyes water. And then, slowly, I saw him. He appeared out of the fog, moving silently toward the car. His face was the same as it had been before, pale, expressionless, and cold. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, I felt paralyzed. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to let him in. But the door was already open, the sound of it clicking in the silence like a death knell. He climbed into the car without a word. As he sat, I could feel the chill radiating from his body, filling the small space around me. I wanted to scream, to get away, but I couldn't. I couldn't move. The drive was silent. His presence in the car was suffocating, and I could barely focus on the road. My mind was spinning, filled with questions I couldn't answer. Why was he here? Why was I still picking him up? Every so often, I would glance at him, but he never looked away from the road ahead. His face was an unsettling blank, as if he wasn't even alive, just some twisted reflection of a man. The smell of smoke was stronger now, overwhelming, like a fire that never went out. And then, just as we reached the edge of town, it happened. Without warning, the fog thickened, and the temperature in the car dropped so rapidly that I could see my breath. The world outside the car seemed to fade into a blur. I turned to look at the hitchhiker, but he was gone. The seat beside me was empty, as if he had never been there at all. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing. The car skidded to a stop, but there was no one on the side of the road. No trace of him. The fog had swallowed everything. My hands were shaking as I tried to catch my breath, but the air was thick with smoke. The eerie silence pressed in around me, and I felt a deep, unrelenting cold in my chest. It was then that I realized something. I was alone in the car, but the smell of smoke was stronger than ever. It was all around me, suffocating me, as though it was coming from inside the car, from somewhere I couldn't see. The whispers started again. Quiet at first, like distant voices calling out to me. I turned to look behind me, but there was nothing. The car was empty. The hitchhiker was gone, but his presence lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. And then I understood. He had never been human. He was something else, something that had been waiting for me, something that had followed me, and something that would never let me go. I had become part of his story, part of his curse. I didn't drive home that night. I couldn't. The fear was too much, and I knew that if I stopped, I would never be able to leave again. I drove through the night, the fog swallowing the road ahead of me, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. The air inside the car was thick with smoke, an acrid, burning scent that refused to leave. The whispers, soft at first, had grown louder, closer. I could hear them now, echoing in the silence of the car, as though they were coming from inside my own head. I tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination, exhaustion, the stress, everything that had happened. But deep down, I knew better. The hitchhiker hadn't just disappeared. He was still here, somehow. Some part of him, some fragment of his ghost, was lingering in the car with me. The road stretched out endlessly before me, but there was no sign of civilization. No streetlights. No houses. Just the fog, thick and suffocating, closing in around me. I couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction, and the weight of the isolation pressed in on me. I glanced at the rearview mirror. The image of the hitchhiker flashed there for a split second, his pale face, the empty eyes staring back at me. But when I looked again, the mirror was empty, reflecting only the swirling mist behind me. I was losing it. I had to be. But the cold, the suffocating cold, wouldn't let me forget. It was everywhere. The chill wasn't just in the air, it was inside me, creeping into my bones, freezing me from the inside out. The smell of smoke was overpowering, and I could feel it clogging my lungs, suffocating me. It felt like I was breathing in the remnants of a fire that had never gone out, a fire that had burned everything, leaving nothing but the ashes of what had once been. The fog seemed to grow denser with every mile, and the road beneath me felt like it was no longer real. It shifted, twisted, as if the path I was on was no longer a road at all, but a dream, a nightmare. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the pavement as I fought to regain control of the car. I had seen something, no, someone, standing in the middle of the road. The hitchhiker. His hand raised, as though beckoning me forward. I couldn't see his face, but I knew it was him. I knew it. I tried to drive around him, to get away, but no matter which direction I went, the road kept bending back to him, to that place. It was like I was trapped in a loop, caught in his web. The engine sputtered and died. The car came to a sudden stop, leaving me alone in the dark, the fog thick around me like a living thing. I was shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers had stopped, but I could still feel his presence, like a shadow on my soul. I opened the door, my legs unsteady as I stepped out onto the cold road. The air was thick, damp, and the fog curled around my feet as if trying to pull me down. I looked around, my breath coming in shallow gasps. There was no sign of the hitchhiker, but the air was heavy with something I couldn't explain, a presence, like I wasn't alone. I called out, my voice shaking, "Hello?" No response. Just the eerie silence, broken only by the sound of the fog moving, swirling, like the world was holding its breath. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him. Standing at the edge of the road, his figure barely visible through the mist. He didn't move, just stood there, watching me. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, my legs unwilling to move. "You shouldn't have picked me up," a voice whispered, though it didn't come from the man. It was the voice of the fog itself, the voice of something ancient and unforgiving. I wanted to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The hitchhiker stepped forward, his face coming into view, though it was still obscured by the fog. His eyes were black pits, empty, as if they had swallowed the light itself. "You've already made your choice," he said, his voice colder than the night air. In that moment, I understood. I had been marked the moment I picked him up, and there was no escaping. He wasn't just a ghost, he was a part of the road, part of the place itself. A shadow, a curse, tied to the very pavement, and I was now a part of that curse. The smell of smoke hit me again, stronger now, suffocating, as though the fog itself was burning. I gasped for air, but the smoke filled my lungs, and I felt the world around me begin to fade. The road, the fog, the hitchhiker, they were all slipping away, distorting, becoming something unreal. And then everything went black. When I woke, I was back in the car. The fog was gone, the air thick with silence. The car was parked by the side of the road, the engine still running. I could feel my heart pounding, but there was no sign of the hitchhiker. I thought I had escaped, but as I looked around, I realized that something had changed. The world outside the car felt wrong, familiar, yet twisted, as though I had never left. I looked at the rearview mirror, and there, for just a moment, I saw his face again. Pale, cold, his eyes staring back at me, empty and endless. The smell of smoke filled the car, choking me, and I knew, without a doubt, that I would never escape him. The road, the hitchhiker, the curse, they would follow me forever, wherever I went. I wasn't just driving anymore. I was lost, trapped, and there was no way out. The bridge in the Louisiana swamps. Have you ever been lost in a place where the air feels thick with secrets, where every turn seems to pull you deeper into the unknown? I was, once. And it all started with a long stretch of road in the Louisiana swamps, a place where the trees are ancient, their gnarled roots twisting through the murky water like the veins of some forgotten creature. I had been driving for hours. It was one of those nights where the darkness seemed to swallow everything. The headlights of my car barely pierced through the fog that rolled over the highway. The swamp was quiet, but in that silence, there was an unsettling presence. The kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl, like the earth itself is holding its breath. The map on my passenger seat was no help. I was supposed to be heading toward a small town upstate, but I'd somehow veered off course. The road had turned unfamiliar, and soon enough, I realized I was alone. No other cars, no signs of life, just endless trees and the distant, eerie croaks of unseen creatures. And then, there it was. The bridge. It stood like a silhouette against the murky water, its rusty metal frame barely visible through the mist. I had read about it, old stories passed around in hushed tones, tales of a bridge that shouldn't be crossed after dark. They said the voices of the lost could still be heard there, and if you listened too closely, they might just call you to join them. I had heard those stories before. Most of the time, I shrugged them off, a little skeptical, a little amused. After all, it's just an old bridge, right? But now, as I approached, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. I slowed down as I neared the bridge. The mist had thickened, swirling like smoke, and the air felt colder. There was a sound, faint at first, but unmistakable. Someone, or something, was calling out. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or the swamp playing tricks on me. But the closer I got, the clearer the cries became. They were desperate. A man, or maybe a woman, calling out for help. Help me, please. I couldn't stop myself. I pulled the car over, the tires crunching against the gravel. The mist around the bridge seemed to thicken, curling in on itself, as if the swamp itself was holding its breath. I turned off the engine, leaving only the sound of the wind in the trees and the strange, haunting cries echoing through the air. I told myself it was just an illusion. Maybe a prank or a trick of the swamp's eerie acoustics. But something about the desperation in that voice felt real. It pulled at something deep inside me, a need to help, to do the right thing. I stepped out of the car, the cold air immediately biting at my skin. My footsteps crunched on the gravel as I made my way toward the bridge. The cries were louder now, clearer. They were coming from the other side of the bridge. Without thinking, I started to cross. The wooden boards creaked underfoot, groaning with every step. The mist hung in the air, thick and suffocating, the world around me turning into a gray blur. But the cries were so real. So close. I reached the end of the bridge, the sound of the water below swallowing up the rest of the world. The cries had stopped. A sudden cold rushed over me, the kind of chill that makes your teeth ache. And then, the silence, deafening, suffocating. I looked around, the fog so dense now I couldn't even see the other side of the bridge. I felt my heart race, my breath quickening. Something wasn't right. The air was wrong. I couldn't tell if it was the swamp itself playing tricks on my mind or something worse. Hello? I called out, but my voice seemed to vanish into the mist, swallowed by the swamp. And then, just as I turned to leave, I saw it. A figure, standing in the distance. A person, or something that looked like one. I couldn't make out their face, but I could feel their eyes on me. They didn't move, didn't speak, but the air around them felt cold. The hairs on my neck prickled, and I froze in place. My heart pounded as I watched them stand there, unmoving, staring back at me. I wanted to run. I wanted to get back to my car and leave, but my feet felt heavy, like they were stuck in the mud. The figure took a step forward, and then another, slowly moving toward me. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from the figure. The mist seemed to swirl around them, wrapping them in shadows, making it harder to see, harder to breathe. Help me. A voice whispered, but it wasn't from the figure. The words seemed to come from everywhere, echoing in the fog. The voice sounded just like the one from before, but there was something different about it now. It wasn't a cry for help anymore, it was a command, cold and insistent. Help me. Come here. Come closer. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, the fog swirling around my feet, making it impossible to move. The mist thickened, drowning out everything else. And then, in the distance, I heard another voice, faint but unmistakable, another person, calling for help. It was coming from the water, from the very depths of the swamp. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, my mind screaming for me to leave, but my body unable to obey. The voices grew louder, blending together in a chorus of desperation and despair, until I couldn't tell which was real and which was just a trick of the swamp. But then, with a sudden jolt, I snapped out of it. I ran. I ran without looking back, my heart pounding in my chest as I tore across the bridge and toward my car. I didn't stop until I was safely inside, the engine roaring to life beneath me. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't left. That the voices, the figures, the swamp, they were all still there, waiting for the next soul to cross their bridge. The last thing I remember before the fog swallowed me whole was the sound of someone knocking at my window. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. My mind replayed the events over and over, like a twisted film I couldn't stop watching. The mist, the voices, the figure in the fog, they haunted me. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear the whispers, feel the chill in the air. I thought about the bridge. The way it had pulled me in, the way it seemed to call to me, like it was waiting for something. Someone. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, the stress of being lost in unfamiliar territory. But deep down, I knew better. Something about that bridge wasn't right. I didn't know why, but I felt an overwhelming urge to go back. The nagging feeling that if I didn't return, I would never be free of it. So, after hours of lying awake, the decision was made. I had to go back. The next day, I found myself driving down the same lonely stretch of road, the fog still hanging thick in the air. It was a Saturday, but the sun was nowhere to be seen, hidden behind the heavy clouds. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Who would believe me? Who would understand? I kept my thoughts to myself, the only company the hum of my tires on the damp asphalt. As I neared the swamp, my heart began to race again, the same familiar fear creeping back into my chest. But I kept going, unable to stop myself. Something about that bridge called to me, like a siren song. I couldn't ignore it. When I saw it up ahead, I almost didn't believe my eyes. The bridge, standing tall and weathered in the mist, just like the night before. But it felt different now. There was no fear, no hesitation. Only curiosity. I parked my car near the edge of the road, the swamp water rippling quietly beneath the bridge. The air felt colder than before, and I could hear the same faint whispers I'd heard last night, carried on the wind. I tried to shake them off, telling myself they were just the sounds of the swamp. Nothing more. But as I stepped out of the car, the chill in the air sent a shiver down my spine. The bridge loomed before me, its wooden planks creaking under the weight of years, its rusty frame covered in moss and grime. I took a deep breath, steeling myself against the fear threatening to rise again. Just walk across, I muttered to myself, my voice shaky. Get over it. I started toward the bridge, my footsteps echoing in the silent swamp. The mist clung to the air, wrapping around me like a blanket, thickening with every step I took. The whispering grew louder, but I refused to let it distract me. I had made my decision. I was going to cross it. As I stepped onto the bridge, the sound of my feet hitting the wood seemed to reverberate in the stillness, too loud, too sharp. I felt like the whole swamp was listening, waiting. The cries began again. At first, they were faint, almost imperceptible, but as I walked further onto the bridge, they grew louder, more desperate. And this time, I could hear them clearly. "Help me! Please! Help me!" My heart pounded. It was the same voice I heard before. That same cry for help. But this time, it sounded different, more urgent, more real. I stopped, glancing around, my breath quickening. I couldn't see anyone, but the voice was unmistakable. I took another step. And then another. The whispers were growing louder, echoing in my ears, surrounding me. "Help me, come back, please." The fog closed in, thick and suffocating. The trees around the bridge seemed to sway, their branches creaking as if something was moving within them. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. And then, I saw it. A figure, standing just ahead of me, barely visible in the swirling mist. At first, it was just a shadow, but as I stepped closer, it became clearer. A man. His clothes were tattered, his face pale and gaunt, eyes wide with fear. He didn't move, didn't speak. But his eyes, they locked onto mine. And in that instant, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like the swamp was alive, watching, waiting. He raised his hand, slowly, as if trying to reach out to me. His mouth moved, but no words came. The mist swirled around him, thickening, hiding his form, but I could still see those eyes, wide, pleading, desperate. "Stay away!" I shouted, my voice trembling. "Stay away from me!" But my feet wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, frozen in fear, unable to tear my gaze away from the figure. I heard a noise behind me, a creak, like wood groaning under pressure. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. The swamp was silent again, as if nothing had ever happened. And then, the figure was gone. Just like that, as if he had never been there at all. The mist closed in, swallowing him whole. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the cold sinking into my bones, my breath shallow and quick. The cries had stopped. The whispering was gone. But the feeling of being watched remained, like something was still there, just beyond my reach. I turned to leave, my heart racing, my legs shaking beneath me. But before I could take another step, I heard it. A voice, soft, barely a whisper, came from the water below. "Help me!" And then, the knock came again. The sound of the knock was faint at first, so quiet it could have been the wind against the bridge, but it was unmistakable. It was a sharp, hollow sound, like someone knocking on a wooden door from underneath. And it didn't stop. It came again. And again. Each knock echoed in my chest, resonating with a hollow, empty sound that made my stomach churn. I stood there, frozen in place, my heart racing as I tried to comprehend what was happening. The figure, the whispering voices, the cries for help, it was all real, but what did it mean? I turned slowly, my feet unwilling to move at first, but then, as if some invisible force was pulling me forward, I took a step closer to the edge of the bridge. I peered down into the murky waters below, straining my eyes to see through the fog. Nothing. But the knocking kept coming. Harder now. Louder. The sound seemed to be getting closer, though I couldn't see where it was coming from. And then, through the mist, I thought I saw something, just a flicker in the water, a shadow moving beneath the surface. A figure. I staggered back, my breath coming in short gasps. It was like I was drawn to it, pulled by some unseen hand. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to run, but my body refused to obey. I took another step closer to the edge, unable to stop myself. The knocking now was so loud, it almost sounded like it was coming from inside my head. The figure in the water became clearer. There was no mistaking it now. It was a man, his body floating just below the surface, his arms reaching out as if begging for help. His face was pale, his eyes wide open, locked on mine, the same desperate expression I had seen on the man on the bridge. And then, just like before, his mouth opened, but no sound came out. Only the knocking. The rhythmic, relentless knocking that seemed to pierce my very soul. "Don't look away," the figure whispered, the voice carrying a strange, otherworldly tone. It wasn't the same voice I'd heard before. It was darker, deeper, almost distorted. I wanted to look away. I wanted to turn and run, but my body refused to obey. The figure's eyes bored into mine, as if they were pulling me in, dragging me toward the water. "Help me," the voice came again, weaker now, as if it were fading, slipping away. My hands trembled as I reached out, as though I could somehow save him, despite knowing there was nothing I could do. But then, the mist shifted, and I realized something. The figure in the water wasn't alone. There were others. Hundreds of them, all floating just beneath the surface, their eyes wide, mouths open in silent screams. The water rippled with movement as they shifted, their ghostly forms rising and falling, reaching up, their hands stretching toward me. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I was paralyzed by fear, my body trembling as I realized the horrifying truth. I wasn't just looking at ghosts. I was looking at the souls of the lost, those who had crossed this bridge before me and never returned. The knocking grew louder, each strike reverberating in my skull. The voices grew frantic, almost pleading. "Don't leave us," they cried, their words melding into one twisted chorus. "You're one of us now." My heart raced as I felt the bridge beneath me begin to shake. The wooden planks creaked, and the sound of groaning would fill the air. The mist was so thick now, I could barely see anything beyond a few feet in front of me. And then, the ground trembled beneath my feet. I felt it, a sharp, sudden pull, as if the swamp itself was reaching out to drag me under. I stumbled, my legs giving way, and I had to catch myself on the railing to avoid falling into the abyss below. The water churned, and I could hear the sound of footsteps, soft at first but growing louder, like someone, or something, was moving toward me from within the fog. "Don't go," the voice whispered again, its tone low and insistent. "Don't leave us. You belong here now." I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know what this place was, but I knew one thing: I had to get out. With every ounce of strength I had left, I turned and ran. I didn't look back, even as I could hear the footsteps behind me, closer now, right at my heels. My feet pounded against the wooden planks, the bridge creaking and groaning under my weight. I could feel something following me, something dark, something alive. The mist swirled around me, thick and suffocating. I ran faster, barely able to breathe, but the sound of footsteps kept getting closer. My heart raced as I pushed myself harder, willing myself to escape, but the bridge seemed to stretch on forever, the exit always just out of reach. And then, as I neared the end of the bridge, I felt it. A hand. Cold. Strong. It gripped my shoulder, and I was pulled backward. I stumbled, falling onto the creaky boards, gasping for air. I rolled onto my back, my eyes wide, expecting to see something coming toward me. But there was nothing. The mist cleared, the fog lifting just enough to let me see the edge of the bridge. And yet, as I stared, I realized something. The road was gone. The path had disappeared into the swamp. The bridge was no longer connected to anything. There was only water, swirling, dark and endless. My stomach churned as the realization hit me. I was trapped. And then, as if to confirm my nightmare, I heard it. A whisper, just behind me. "You can never leave." I tried to move, tried to stand, but my body was frozen. Every muscle was stiff, my legs unresponsive, and my mind was clouded with a thick fog of panic. The water in front of me seemed to ripple and shift, as if the swamp itself was alive, watching, waiting. I could still hear the whispers, soft at first, but growing louder, more insistent. "You can't leave," the voice repeated, now clearer, as if it was standing right behind me. I whirled around, my heart racing, but there was nothing. Just the same empty stretch of bridge, the same oppressive mist, the same suffocating silence that had fallen over the place. Yet, I felt it, a presence, an energy that seemed to surround me, closing in, tightening like a vice. I staggered backward, my breath shallow, panicking. "What do you want from me?" I shouted into the emptiness, my voice hoarse with fear. The words felt weak, lost against the overwhelming silence that followed. The mist swirled, thickening again, and I stumbled forward. Something, some force, was dragging me toward the edge of the bridge. My feet felt as though they were stuck in the rotting wood, and every step was a struggle. The whispers were now a cacophony, a chorus of voices that blended together into an indistinguishable hum. They spoke of forgotten travelers, lost souls, people like me who had stepped onto the bridge and vanished into the swamp, becoming part of its legend. "You belong here," they crooned, their voices threading together like a song sung by the dead. I shook my head, my mind whirling with confusion. I didn't belong here. I was just a traveler, a simple passerby, trying to get through the swamp. I wasn't supposed to be caught in this nightmare, in this strange purgatory where the rules of reality twisted and bent. I needed to escape. I needed to find a way out. Suddenly, I felt it, the cold, clammy grip on my arm again, like ice sinking into my skin. My body screamed in protest as I tried to break free, but the grip was too strong, too powerful. I turned in a frenzy, my heart racing as I scanned the bridge, the mist, the water below. There, on the other side of the bridge, I saw a figure. A shadowy figure standing just at the edge of the fog, watching me with eyes that gleamed faintly in the darkness. It was a man, or at least it looked like one, a tall, thin figure, his face obscured by the haze. But there was something off about him, something wrong in the way he stood, in the way his body shifted unnaturally in the fog. I opened my mouth to scream, to warn myself not to go any closer, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, and I couldn't catch my breath. The shadowy figure began to move toward me, gliding across the bridge, as if floating above the rotting wood, his steps eerily silent. "Don't run," the voice whispered in my ear, and I could feel a presence breathing down my neck. The coldness of it was suffocating, freezing me in place. The figure came closer, and I could see it now. His face was pale, drained of color, with hollow, empty eyes that stared straight into mine. His mouth was stretched into a thin, cruel smile. It was a smile that told me everything I needed to know. He was not human, not anymore. He was one of them. "You should have listened," he said, his voice soft, almost regretful. "You should have never crossed this bridge. Now you're part of the swamp story. Forever." The air grew thick, the temperature dropping rapidly as if the swamp itself was closing in on me. I could see the darkness in the man's eyes, an abyss that seemed to swallow all light. The whispers behind me grew louder, more urgent. "You belong here," they chanted in unison, their voices like a cold wind echoing through my skull. I stumbled backward, nearly falling into the water, but something caught me, some invisible force holding me in place. I couldn't breathe. My body trembled uncontrollably, my heart pounding in my chest as I looked into the figure's eyes, helpless to move. The bridge shook beneath my feet, the sound of the wood groaning as if it was alive. The man reached out toward me, his hand stretching unnaturally far, like it was being pulled by strings. I wanted to scream, to escape, but my voice was lost in the chaos of my racing thoughts. And then, with a sudden motion, the figure lunged toward me, and I was falling. Falling into the darkness, the mist swallowing me whole. The last thing I heard before everything went silent was the sound of a woman's voice, calling out for help, her cries blending with the echoes of my own fear. I woke up with a start. The sunlight hit my eyes, and I gasped for air, feeling the ground beneath me solid and real. I was no longer on the bridge. I was lying on the soft earth beside it, my hands trembling as I pushed myself into a sitting position. The swamp was still, the mist gone, the cries faded into nothing. Was it a dream? A nightmare? I couldn't tell. My mind was too fogged, too clouded by the events that had just transpired. But the feeling was undeniable, the sense that something had changed. That I had crossed a line, stepped into something that wasn't meant for me, and that I couldn't undo it. I stood up, my body unsteady, and turned to look at the bridge. The sun was rising, casting a golden light over the swamp, but in my gut, I knew one thing for certain: the bridge wasn't just a bridge anymore. It was a doorway. A doorway to something far darker, something that could never be fully escaped. I stepped away from the edge of the swamp, my heart still racing, the whispers lingering in my mind. I had left the bridge behind me, but it would never leave me. And as I walked away, I could hear the sound of footsteps behind me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The air around me felt heavier now, like something had been tethered to me, something that couldn't be undone. Every step I took away from the bridge seemed to echo, but the sound was strange, distant, like it was coming from somewhere far behind me, yet I knew I hadn't made those steps. My heart thundered in my chest as I turned around, but there was nothing. The swamp lay still, and the bridge was distant, its silhouette almost comforting in the early morning light. But the feeling remained, like a cold hand on the back of my neck. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was still disoriented from everything I'd experienced, lost in some lingering haze of terror. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The moment I had crossed that bridge, the world had changed in ways I couldn't explain. I walked faster, my boots crunching on the dry, cracked earth as I moved farther from the swamp. The smell of moss and decay lingered in the air, mixing with the faint scent of something burning. I thought back to the man on the bridge, his eyes, that twisted smile, and the way the whispers had followed me. It all felt like a fever dream, too vivid to be a mere hallucination. But then again, could I trust what my mind was telling me? How could I explain the chilling cold, the unnatural way that shadow had moved, the voices? My skin prickled, and I had the sudden urge to look back. I didn't. I couldn't. I was almost out of the swamp, almost free of the curse that had gripped me. I didn't want to see it again, whatever it was. I just needed to get out. A rustling in the underbrush made me freeze. My pulse spiked, and I forced myself to stay still. My eyes darted around, scanning the dense trees, the thick fog now rising in patches between the swamp's twisted trees. I couldn't see anything, no movement, no shapes, just the eerie quiet. I took another step, then another. But the rustling came again, louder this time, and much too close. It was followed by a distant, faint sound, a voice, barely audible but unmistakable. It was a woman's voice, trembling, as if it was calling out from deep within the swamp. "Help me, please." The hairs on my neck stood on end. I froze in place, the blood draining from my face. I knew that voice. No, it couldn't be. I turned quickly, eyes scanning the area around me. The woman's voice echoed again, but this time it sounded even closer, so close I could almost feel her breath on my skin. Panic gripped me, and I took a step backward. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. The voice responded, but this time it wasn't just one woman, it was multiple voices, all overlapping, all crying out for help. The sound was a jumbled mess, filled with desperation, pleading, calling out from the depths of the swamp. "You're lost, just like us," one of the voices whispered, a shiver crawling down my spine. I backed away slowly, heart pounding. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. The rustling grew louder, closer, something was moving toward me, through the thick swamp. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, closing in, getting nearer with every passing second. Suddenly, there was a sharp crack of branches breaking, and out of the mist emerged a figure. It was a man, gaunt and disheveled, his clothes torn and wet, his face pale, eyes hollow and wide with terror. I didn't wait to ask questions. I turned and ran, my legs pumping as fast as they could go. But the swamp seemed endless. No matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I pushed myself, the mist never lifted. The rustling continued, getting closer, the voices never stopping. They followed me like shadows, like ghosts, their hands stretching toward me, reaching from behind the veil of fog. I glanced back, seeing the figure moving with unnatural speed, too fast for a man. His face twisted in an expression of despair and anger, as if he were calling me to join him, joining them, the lost souls of the swamp. The man's eyes met mine, and for a split second, I saw it, the same hollow, dead stare I had seen on the bridge. The same eyes. I stumbled, almost falling, my heart in my throat. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I pushed myself harder, desperate to get away, to leave this nightmare behind. The swamp was relentless, the darkness creeping into my vision. The cries of the lost grew louder, almost deafening, their voices now mingling with the sound of the man's footsteps, echoing in my ears. Then, just as the man reached out toward me, as if to grab me, to pull me into the darkness, I heard a loud crack, and everything went silent. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. The air was still, the voices gone, the fog parted enough to reveal the faint outline of a road. I had crossed into the clear again, into reality. But something was wrong. I looked down at my hands, my arms trembling as I reached up to wipe the sweat from my forehead. I felt cold. Too cold. As I stood up, the air shifted once more, and I heard it, a faint sound, like whispers on the wind. A voice, calling out to me from the mist. "You can't escape." I turned, and for a moment, I saw it again, the shadowy figure from the bridge, standing just out of reach. Then, in an instant, it vanished, swallowed by the fog. But I knew, deep in my soul, that it wasn't gone. It was waiting for me. The curse of the bridge, the swamp, the lost souls, the endless whispers, had followed me, and it would never let me go. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.